What's new, folks? Glad you're with us tonight. A late night chat. It is Good Friday. So, those of you who observe Good Friday, I give you Good Friday greetings. Easter's coming up on Sunday. For those of you who don't observe that holiday or have another religious tradition, I offer you a hand of friendship and greetings for whatever this day means for you. Thanks for joining us. A lot of things we're going to talk about tonight. So be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. The way this show works, the way we work here on this YouTube channel, turning around the. Oh, goodness gracious. The light went out, and there we go. All right, great. Still trying to figure out the lighting in here. The way it works here on this YouTube channel is that I give my opening remarks. Last day of Passover on Sunday, so if you're observing Passover, my Passover greetings to you. The way it works here on this YouTube channel is that I give my opening remarks, and then from there, after I give my opening remarks, I call you out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, I answer your super chat questions. So as the super chats keep coming in, as you send me super chats, I write the super chats down on this piece of paper with this lovely pen. And then at the second half of our show, after we do the opening, I answer your super chat questions. That's how we do it. I've got plenty of unnamed water beverage here to drink to keep my throat going, despite the fact that it is definitely allergy season. It is spring here in New York City. A lot of things to talk about. Now, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer right now, because I know when it comes to the topic of religion, we all have different views, and this is not a religious YouTube channel. It's not, right? I mean, this is a YouTube channel about anti-imperialism, about socialism, about world events and news, about philosophy and history. It's not a religious YouTube channel. I am not on here to push my religious beliefs. And if your religious beliefs are, if you are, different than me, that's totally cool, right? I think that religion has no place in politics. I think that we have a secular government here in the United States, and I maintain that there should be no religious test for any member of a political organization, right? If you're a socialist, if you're a Marxist, if you're an anti-imperialist, there should be no religious test. There should be no requirement that people of a communist group believe in atheism or Christianity or Islam or Judaism or Buddhism or Taoism or anything like that. I believe in secular revolutionary organizations. Your religion is your personal business, your personal matter. Your soul is your problem. Revolutionary organizations deal in politics and ideology, and it's a different kind of thing. That is my position. I am a Protestant Christian. That is my religious viewpoint. I'm not a member of any denomination at this time, but I come from a Protestant Christian perspective. But if you are Roman Catholic, if you are Eastern Orthodox, if you are a Muslim, Shia, Sunni, if you are an atheist, if you are Jewish, if you are a Buddhist, if you are an agnostic, that is all your personal business. On tonight's live, I'm going to be talking about the history of Christianity from the Marxian perspective. I'm going to be drawing heavily from Karl Kautsky. And I'm going to be talking about Easter, and I'm going to be talking about Good Friday, and I'm going to be talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, etc. So if that kind of thing bothers you, which it does bother some people, there are some people that just, it's not their cup of tea. And I totally respect that. And in fact, when I was a teenager, I was so sick of hearing about religion. I was from a really, really small town, and everything had to be about religion. I was not an evangelical. I grew up as a mainline Protestant. And most of the people in my town had an evangelical perspective. And I was so sick and tired of evangelicals. And I swear, hearing teachers, go on evangelical rants in the middle of class and hearing, people make statements about politics, and I was so sick of it. So, if I were the age that I was when I was a teenager, if I were, 15, 16, 17, and somebody was on there, it was a communist podcast, and I got on there and they were going to talk religion, I'd probably turn it off. So if you are one of those people, you have the right to do that. You don't have to listen to me tonight. And if you don't want to hear religious content, if you don't want to hear talk about religion, that's okay. And that'll be later, right, in my opening remarks. That's not the most pressing issue at hand. But I will be talking some religion later. So if you don't want to hear that, totally cool. And please do not think I'm trying to build some kind of religious organization that, the Center for Political Innovation, which I'm involved with, this educational socialist organization, is somehow oriented toward my religious beliefs. It is not, right? Religion is a personal matter. That has been the position of revolutionary Marxists. Religion is a personal matter. So I just want to give that disclaimer, okay? And I just want to be absolutely clear about that. So I've given that disclaimer. Let me repeat that. All right, very good question. Why so many pro-life GOP? So I just want to be clear about that. But that's actually what I'm going to say about Easter and Good Friday and Christianity and stuff. That later, because probably the most pressing issue is what happened today at the U.S. Capitol. The U.S. Capitol, a 25-year-old man who was African American drove his car into two Capitol Hill police officers. He killed one of them with his car. One of them is still in the hospital. He then got out of his car and brandished a knife, at which point he was shot dead. Horrendous event, right? Our condolences go out to the family members of this police officer who must be devastated. Look, I mean, if this police officer was a father, those kids are going to grow up without a dad. That's not cool, right? If this police officer, he obviously had parents, and those parents are going to be grieving the loss of their son. How horrendous it must be to turn on the TV and hear about a Capitol police officer being killed and have that lump in your throat, and then find out that it was your son who got killed, or your father who got killed, or your uncle, or your brother. It's heartbreaking, okay? And put any of your anger, this is not the place for Black Lives Matter, police brutality stuff. This guy wasn't doing anything but being a police officer. He was being a police officer in the U.S. Capitol. He wasn't brutalizing anybody. He was just, doing his job, and he died. And that's horrendous. And he was murdered by this individual who drove their car into him. And that, and that's awful. And we can feel nothing but empathy for the family, nothing but empathy, empathy for the relatives. And it's just a horrendous thing that happened, right? When someone takes their car and drives it into somebody. Cars being used as dangerous weapons is a deadly trend. We know about Charlottesville and Heather Heyer, and we know now there was a car attack in Times Square, and and it shows that the problem we have with mass shootings in the United States, it goes way deeper. It goes way, way deeper, I would say, than just an issue of guns. Gun control, that's a separate conversation, but it goes way, way deeper than the issue of guns, because we have a big problem in the United States with the issue of yes, Biden's infrastructure plan. I can talk about that. We have a big issue in the United States with the issue of violence and people who snap and start killing people. We have a big issue with it, and that issue has to be addressed, and it must be addressed. Absolutely must be addressed. So I just wanted to get that point out of the way. It's a very important point that needs to be made. Now, the other thing I wanted to quickly mention, is, we know what happened. So apparently this 25-year-old young man who did this horrendous, event, and, the Capitol's already on lockdown, and we've got the National Guard out there and those big barricades ever since January 6th. Well, apparently this young man who perpetrated this attack, apparently on his Facebook, it said he referred to himself as a follower of Louis Farrakhan. Now, who's Louis Farrakhan? Louis Farrakhan is the leader of the Nation of Islam, which is a black nationalist religious organization that has been in the United States since the 1930s. Malcolm X was a leader of the Nation of Islam for a long time. It was started by Wallace Farad Muhammad, and he eventually disappeared, and then you had the rise of the individual named Elijah Muhammad. They call him the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. He was the leader of it for many years. All right, what is this super chat? Marx's political line, getting to the masses. Oh, okay, sure. Thanks for the super chat, writing it down. To the masses. What does it mean? All right, so this individual, 25-year-old young man, African American, put on his Facebook that he was a follower of Louis Farrakhan, and he posted some speeches on his Facebook about how he liked the Nation of Islam. Well, look, that doesn't mean anything. Anyone can post anything on their Facebook. Did you know that? I could post on my Facebook right now that I was a follower of Louis Farrakhan, and that wouldn't make Farrakhan in any way responsible for anything I say, right? Anybody can post on their Facebook anything. And Minister Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam are a group that is very, very, very disciplined, right? They are very strict in their rules. You cannot break the law. You cannot eat certain foods, from what I understand. They have a very strict way of living. You see them out there selling their newspaper. They have a group called the Fruit of Islam that is like even kind of a security organization that's even more highly disciplined. And the notion that this young man did what he did somehow in coordination with the Nation of Islam is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that somehow this individual who clearly had some kind of psychological problems and put some crazy stuff on his Facebook, to think that somehow he did this in coordination with the Nation of Islam is absolutely outrageous. He put something on his Facebook that he was a follower of the Nation of Islam. That's it, okay? I have not seen one shred of evidence that he was actually a member of the Nation of Islam. They do have formal membership, right? You say people only seek revolution. Not. Accelerationist. Stalin poisoned. That was one was the year they claimed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. 20. WMDs. Wrote it down, and thank you for the super chats, writing them down. But look, the Nation of Islam, it's important to know what the Nation of Islam is, right? A lot of people don't know what it is. A lot of people think that they're just Muslims, they're Sunnis, or Shias. It's a unique U.S. religious tradition. It started in Detroit. They call him Master Farad was the founder, and it was a religious group in Detroit. After a while, you had the rise of Elijah Muhammad, and this was in the 1930s, and it spread all over the United States. And African Americans who were suffering at that point, you had Jim Crow segregation. You had many African Americans in the urban centers of the United States who were the last hired and the first fired and facing horrendous conditions. They joined this organization, this black nationalist organization. And there's a long history of black nationalism in the United States. You can go back to Marcus Garvey and the Back to Africa movement and such. And in the 1930s, you had the rise of the Nation of Islam, the NOI. All right, we can talk about that. And the Nation of Islam, they have very specific beliefs, which I'm not going to get into. You can read about them on your own, or the best place to learn about them is to actually listen to members of the Nation of Islam talk about them. I wouldn't trust Wikipedia or somebody else to tell you what they believe. I would listen to what they actually believe. But I'm not going to represent their beliefs here because I'm not a member of their group. I'm not an adherent of their organization, and I'm a white guy, right? It's an African American nationalist group for African Americans only. So even if I did believe what they wanted, I still couldn't be in the Nation of Islam. They have some very specific beliefs, and they have their beliefs, Malcolm X joined the group in the late 1940s, if I'm not mistaken, maybe the early 50s. He rose to prominence as a very important African American voice in the United States. He eventually had a falling out with the Nation of Islam. They continue to be a very, very big organization in the black community. After Elijah Muhammad died, his son took on the leadership of the Nation of Islam, and he dissolved the organization. And they became Sunnis. But then in the late 70s, Minister Louis Farrakhan broke with the son of Elijah Muhammad and restarted the Nation of Islam to continue to believe what they had believed in their founding, what the Elijah Muhammad group had taught, right? Under the leadership of Minister Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam has distinguished itself as an anti-imperialist organization, very friendly to Cuba. Minister Louis Farrakhan has gone to Cuba many times. He's a huge supporter of Cuba. I will never forget, right? I mean, one of the most important things the Nation of Islam did was they had the Million Man March, which happened in the 1990s. I was a kid. I don't have any memory of that, but it was big news at the time. A huge gathering of African American men. But on the 10-year anniversary of the Million Man March, I was a high school student and I was getting into revolutionary politics. And so I went into the computer lab at my high school and I watched on C-SPAN the speech of Minister Louis Farrakhan at the 10-year anniversary of the Million Man March. And in that speech, Minister Louis Farrakhan quoted from Mao. He quoted from Mao and how the Chinese Communist Party related to artists. Amazing. And he also talked about Cuba. And he talked about how Cuba was a country that America should learn from. Because Cuba is a country where the government cares for the poor and fights for the people against big corporations. I mean, it was amazing, this speech that he gave, this 2-hour speech that I watched on C-SPAN as a high school student, where Minister Louis Farrakhan was condemning George W. Bush. It was just in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where many African Americans had been left on their rooftops to die as the floodwaters hit New Orleans. Amazing speech, quoting from the Little Red Book, condemning the U.S. invasion of Iraq, hailing China and talking, before the Belt and Road was a thing, he was already talking about China and how China and its role in Africa was good and how, investment in Africa by Chinese corporations was good. And I remember he said to Tony Blair and George Bush, he said, if you really care about Africa, why don't you do what China has done? Why don't you go to Africa and build a railroad? Why don't you go to Africa and build hospitals? He called out the American government for not doing for Africa what the Chinese have done for Africa. Just amazing stuff. It was a thoroughly anti-imperialist speech. He talked about justice for the poor and about how economics is underlying racism in the United States. And I saw this speech as a high school kid, 10-year anniversary of the Million Man March, and I was like, I think it was 2005, and I was like, wow. This guy is an anti-imperialist. And he absolutely is an anti-imperialist. Minister Louis Farrakhan is an anti-imperialist. And, as I got to be politically active in Cleveland, I would see members of the Nation of Islam selling their newspaper, the Final Call newspaper. And I would always buy the Final Call newspaper whenever I saw a member of the Nation of Islam selling it. And I would read the Final Call newspaper. And it's a great newspaper. It's up-to-date events in Africa, analysis of events in the United States. It's a really good newspaper. It used to be, before the pandemic, the newsstands in New York City were much more active. And I remember I would see it on newsstands here in New York City. I would always buy a copy of the Final Call. Now, when I moved to New York City, at the very end of 2010, 2011, that was the summer. It was the summer that Occupy Wall Street started. But before that, it was the summer that Libya faced NATO intervention. And I will never forget the Millions March in Harlem, where the Nation of Islam mobilized thousands of people to come out and march against the bombing of Libya. And Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney was there, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark was there, and thousands of black people poured into the streets of Harlem to support Gaddafi and to stand against imperialism. And it was great. And I was part of a small communist group at that time, and we had rallies against the bombing of Libya that maybe had 100, 200 people, but Nation of Islam, they had rallies against the bombing of Libya, and there were thousands of people there. Thousands of people came out. It was very, very beautiful to see thousands of people come out and condemn the bombing of Libya. And all the Trotskyites were silent. All the anarchids were silent. Most of the leftist groups wouldn't dare protest the bombing of Libya. But Minister Louis Farrakhan, he called out, and the black community responded because he is so loved. I mean, the Nation of Islam, they have organized gang truces. That's one of the things they've done is they've organized gang truces and stopped gangs from killing each other. They have in some cases been able to de-escalate situations between the police and the black community. Fascism is when imperialism comes to the imperial court. All right, writing it down. And I mean, they have done really amazing stuff, and they have anti-drug programs where people that are addicted to drugs. I mean, drug addiction is a big problem, and they work in prisons to get people off of drugs. The Nation of Islam has done such amazing, amazing work throughout the United States. There's a comedian, Dick Gregory. There's a comedian. He talked about how, and the black community, and he was not a member of the Nation of Islam, but he talked about how in the 1950s and 60s, the Nation of Islam turned around so many lives in the black community, getting people off of drugs, getting people by changing their diet, having them live a disciplined lifestyle, and that, the Nation of Islam is such an important group in the United States. At this point, when Minister Louis Farrakhan speaks, right, he can go and speak in Pittsburgh. He can go and speak in Washington D.C., in Cleveland, in Mississippi, in Alabama, and he's getting at least 4,000-5,000 people will turn out to hear him speak. And honestly, some people look at the presidential election of 2016 and they wonder, because Minister Louis Farrakhan, he did not say to vote for Donald Trump. He never said that, and people will misquote that. He never said to vote for Trump, but he did say that Hillary Clinton was a wicked woman, and he was going around the country telling audiences of African Americans that Hillary Clinton was a wicked woman for what she did to Gaddafi. Just a dynamic speaker. So, look, I don't agree with the Nation of Islam on a number of things, and they don't want me to agree with them because, again, I'm a white guy. But I did have the honor of going to the Islamic Republic of Iran and attending the New Horizon Conference with members of the Nation of Islam. And that was a real honor for me to be able to sit in the same room with Nation of Islam members and writers for the Final Call newspaper and interact with them. To have my picture in Final Call newspaper afterwards when they wrote the report about the conference was a real honor for me. I think very highly of the Nation of Islam. And some teenager or some 25-year-old who wrote something on his Facebook and said something about, he likes Farrakhan and then committed a horrendous act. That doesn't have anything to do with Farrakhan. Anyone can put anything on their Facebook. Anyone can put anything on their Twitter. All right? And blaming that on Minister Farrakhan and trying to say that Minister Farrakhan is now somehow responsible for what this teenager did, or why do I keep calling him a teenager? He's 25 years old. What this 25-year-old did, that is dishonesty. But it's true that mainstream media does have it in for the Nation of Islam. It scares them to see an anti-imperialist, a revolutionary like Minister Farrakhan, be able to mobilize people. They can get 1 million, 500,000 people to Washington, D.C. when they mobilize. And, at their big rallies in Washington, D.C., the Nation of Islam will have speakers from the Cuban parliament. Right? They've had members of the Cuban parliament speak over a jumbotron to audiences. Right? They will have indigenous speakers. They will have Arab Americans speak. They will have Native Americans speak. They are an anti-imperialist organization. They have an anti-imperialist viewpoint. They are pro-China. Their newspaper often reprints articles from RT, the TV network RT, and they'll often reprint articles from RT, from Press TV. They're sympathetic to Iran and the Iranians and their struggle against imperialism. They're really a dynamic group, really a dynamic organization. So, you know, I'm not endorsing their viewpoint. I don't agree with them on a number of things, and they know that, and they don't want me to. But to blame them for this horrendous attack, the media is now in overdrive, right? They've been looking to go after Farrakhan for a long time. About a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a leader of Black Lives Matter Incorporated who attended an event with Minister Farrakhan, and CNN covered it, and Anderson Cooper and people like that did whole hit pieces demanding that Black Lives Matter denounce Minister Farrakhan. They hate the fact that this guy is anti-imperialist, and he is anti-imperialist. He is very, very anti-imperialist, and that's why they want to look for any opportunity to smear his name, smear his reputation, and don't fall for it. That's my advice to you. Don't fall for it. Again, anyone can put anything on their Facebook. The Nation of Islam is a disciplined organization, and no actual in good standing member of the Nation of Islam, I can assure you, would ever drive their car into a police officer and kill them like this man did. No disciplined, good standing, member in good standing of their organization would do anything remotely like that. Don't let the media propaganda get to your head. And I hope, my goal is that in the next couple days to interview. I don't know if it'll be possible or not. I know they have a million things. Right now they're scrambling to deal with a media attack. But if possible, I want to try, Webster Tarpley, I want to try to, if possible, get a minister from the Nation of Islam, or get someone from the Nation of Islam or from the Final Call newspaper to come on this YouTube channel and set the record straight, and tell the truth about what's going on, because the media is coming down on them like a ton of bricks. Fox News is demanding the Democrats denounce Farrakhan. And then on top of that, we've got Democrats saying, no, Farrakhan supported Trump. He's a Trump supporter. And they're throwing him under the bus like that, even though the Nation of Islam is very friendly with many Democrats. They have been friendly with many urban Democrats, right? They have to have an alliance as an important force in the community. So to see the Democrats just throw them under the bus, and there you go. Aren't U.S. imperialists shooting them in the foot? Okay, U.S. So I just want to make that point absolutely clear, and urge people not to buy into the wave of propaganda against the Nation of Islam. So now I'm actually going to do something I really hate to do, but it's kind of a safety thing. I have to do something for like 1 second on the other side of the room here. So I'm just going to lift up the camera right here, and I'm just going to step off screen for like 2 seconds to handle a safety issue, and I will be right back. There's just something I have to move, basically. Just something I need to move. 1 quick second. 1 quick second. So I'm just going to step off camera here. Trying to not make the camera shake here. 1 quick second. 1 quick second. Stay with me. Stay with me. Stay with me. Okay. Alrighty. Are you still there, folks? Still there? All right. Cool. Just had to handle one little safety issue there in the room. Something was right next to the heater. It is very cold here today, and didn't want there to be a fire, so I had to step off screen for just a moment and make sure there was not a fire. But there you go. There you go. I didn't want you to see me burning up on screen. I had to. Yeah, someone says I just killed a CIA agent. There you go. Rare moment. Hey, look, folks, this is not the most professional setup. I don't have like some big fancy studio. I do have like a light I'm using right now, but this isn't like the most professional thing. And that's how you know I'm genuine. Look, if I was some big phony who was feeding you propaganda and trying to convince you to believe the lies of the empire, I'd have some elaborate, expensive setup on here. But I don't, right? I'm a real dude. I'm a real guy. And I think that's very apparent. The funniest thing, right? Anyone who knows me in real life, which some of you in the chat do, not all of you, I am just like this in real life. I mean, if you have dinner with me, I am exactly the way I am. I mean, on this thing. I am totally real with you all. Someone said there's a super chat that went by. I don't want to miss it. So, is there a super chat? Aren't the U.S. imperialists shooting themselves in the foot? All right. Well, write that down just to make sure. Yeah, shooting themselves in the foot. But just wanted to get that out of the way. So now that we talked about today and why you cannot blame the foot, I want to talk about, since today is Good Friday, I do want to talk a little bit, about religion. I want to talk about religion, and we're just gonna have a brief religious conversation, folks. Christianity as a religion is very, very interesting to study because Christianity, it started in Palestine, in Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, right? You had Jesus of Nazareth preaching. But the reason that Christianity became a worldwide religion, the reason it took hold in Europe, is because of the Roman Empire. Right? We know that there was some individual who is now referred to as Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, that existed at some people argue he was a composite figure and that he was several different figures combined. But at the time that Jerusalem was occupied by the Roman Empire, there were many uprisings among the Jews against the Romans. There were many uprisings and there were many revolts that took place. And most likely what historians tell us is that Jesus Christ is a composite figure inspired by various individuals who led uprisings among the Jewish people against the Roman Empire and did so with a religious teaching. There were a number of such figures, and the understanding we now have of Jesus is probably that he was a composite of a number of individuals, very charismatic individuals who led uprisings against the Roman Empire. Now, Jesus Christ, we understand, was crucified. And crucifixion was the harshest penalty you could get in Rome, right? In Rome, they did kill people all the time. They would cut their heads off. They would beat them to death. They had all kinds of ways of killing people. But crucifixion, nailing somebody to a cross and displaying their body in public until they died, that was reserved for the most vile criminals, generally. It was reserved for soldiers who deserted. If you were a soldier and you ran away and didn't want to fight, they would do that to you. Slaves who escaped, they would sometimes crucify them to make an example for the other slaves. But the main reason the Romans crucified people was because they were what they called enemies of the state. They were people who engaged in rebellions against the Roman Empire. And that's why they were crucified. Crucifixion, is a very awful way to die. So the fact that Jesus Christ was crucified indicates that he was considered to be some kind of revolutionary. Now, fast forward. So why is it that Christianity caught on as a world religion? Well, because back then, Rome, the Roman Empire, was the center of the world, right? The world revolved around Rome. Rome was the capital of the Roman Empire, and it was in the capital of the Roman Empire that you had the proletariat. That's the first time in history that you had proletarians, the working class. Nowhere in the world did you have proletarians until you had the city of Rome. What is a proletarian? A proletarian is not a slave. A slave is the property of someone else, right? A slave is owned literally by someone else. Proletarian is not a landowner, right? They don't live by, exploiting people who work for them. A proletarian is, in Roman society, a proletarian was somebody who had nothing but their children. The word proletarian literally means to procreate in Roman. It was somebody who owned nothing but their own children. They did not own any land, they did not own any property, but they were also not a slave. They are the kind they were people who sold their labor power to survive, right? And this is in the Communist Manifesto. The proletariat is defined. Karl Marx says the proletariat must sell themselves piecemeal like any other commodity. And they live only so long as they find work, and they work only so long as their labor enriches capital. Right? This is what it means to be a proletarian. That a proletarian is somebody who does not own any property, but is also not a slave, someone who sells their labor power in order to live. And that having a proletariat in Rome, and that, that introduced all kinds of new things. The proletarians of Rome were not Romans. If you were in Rome, you owned property, right? The patricians and the plebeians of Rome, they all had property. Meanwhile, there were, slaves, they lived on somebody's property. But proletarians were people from somewhere else, primarily from Greece or from Palestine, right? They were Jews or Greeks who came to Rome because they had a skill. They were pipe fitters. They were carpenters. They were masons or bricklayers, right? That proletarians were people that had specific skills, and they would sell those skills to bosses. Doctors were often proletarians. They did have slave doctors also. It was Julius Caesar who freed all doctors from slavery. He said you can't have a doctor be a slave, and made doctors into proletarians. But sometimes proletarians were teachers, right? They did have teachers. People that could speak many different languages would be hired by the Roman patricians and plebeians to teach them different languages. They had teachers, doctors, bricklayers, carpenters and woodworkers, people that did pipes, right? In Rome, you had like the beginnings of a sewage system. So, pipe fitters, right? Metal workers, blacksmiths. That's what a proletarian was. And the proletariat was a big part of the Roman population. You had proletarians. And what made proletarians interesting and what caused big problems in Roman society was that proletarians, when they are not finding work, they can't pay their rent anymore, and they're kicked out of where they live. And Rome was the first society in history, thank you, Gene, the first society in history to have homeless people. There had never been homeless people anywhere in the world. Slaves, they had a place to stay, their master who owned them. Landowners, they owned land, they lived there. But proletarians, they couldn't work. They were homeless. And Rome had thousands and thousands of homeless children. And it was something that no one could understand. People from all over the world would come to Rome, and they would see these children begging on the streets. And they would say, how is this possible? Rome is the wealthiest city in the world. The whole world is paying taxes and rent to Rome. But yet, on the streets, they have children who are hungry and come up to you begging you to give them money. How is this possible? How is this possible? Roman Empire was a force of good because it brought a huge free trade zone to the Mediterranean. All right. How is this possible, right? How people it didn't make sense, but it did make sense, right? That Rome was the first society where you had proletarians. And if you have proletarians, you can have homelessness, right? Another aspect of Rome is that Rome was a society that very much believed that might makes right. The founding myth of Rome is about Romulus and Remus, right? And that's where the name Rome comes from. It's after Romulus. They were two brothers, and their father abandoned them, two twin brothers, abandoned them by the edge of a river, and they were abandoned. And so they were raised by a wolf, by a she-wolf, or a mother wolf raised them. And so they were raised by a wolf. And because these two brothers, Romulus and Remus, were not raised by human parents, but instead raised by wolves, like wild predators, this is a legend, of course, because of that, they became very, very strong, right? They didn't have human kindness and human compassion. They became very, very strong and ruthless, like wolves. They took on the attributes of a wolf. They learned to be predators. And because they learned to be predators, they became mighty, right? That's how the legend goes, that they became stronger than other people. They were basically, because they did not have parents, because they were abandoned as children and raised by wild animals, the Romans believed that Romulus and Remus were great because they basically, because of that, became psychopaths, right? So basically, Rome was founded by two abandoned children who turned into psychopaths. That's basically the founding myth of Rome. And they thought it was great. And that there's a statue in the Roman, in the capital, they had this statue of the she-wolf nursing the two twin boys. That was like the symbol of the founding of Rome. And these two psychopath brothers, they rose to power. One of them killed the other one. I believe Romulus killed Remus. They had a rivalry. And that's how the Roman Empire started. And Rome was very much a predator society, right? The Romans didn't go around the world building things. They went around the world taking things. They went to other countries, and at the point that they built a big army, a mighty army, then at the point of a spear, they forced other societies that had kings and all that to give them their people as slaves, and to give them their loot, and their crops, their property, and that's how the Roman Empire worked. And within the Roman Empire, if you were the king of Egypt, or if you were the pharaoh of Egypt, or if you were the king of Persia or something, they let you keep your empire as long as you paid them tribute, and that's how it worked. And there's a saying that people say, all roads lead to Rome, right? Georgia voting laws. All roads lead to Rome. What that meant was that they were the middleman in global trade. You could not trade with another place on your own. If you wanted, you could only trade with Rome. They were the middle. All the roads led to Rome. You could not build a road from one side of the empire to another. You had to build a road that went to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. That's how the Roman Empire worked. They were a global middleman in trade. They had the biggest army, and they, with their biggest army, forced a monopoly on trade. That's how the Roman Empire worked. And the Roman Empire, it was in North Africa, and it was in the Middle East, and it stretched all the way up to half of Britain. They eventually conquered half of Britain, all the way up to, I believe it's Hadrian's Wall. Right? So it was a huge empire. All of Europe, France, Germany, all these places, right? It was a very, very big empire. They claimed that they conquered the entire world. Well, they didn't really, but it looked that way. If you look at a map, that was all of what they called the known world at the time. Greece, Egypt, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, even up into Britain. The Romans claimed they controlled the whole world. And it was an empire founded on ruthlessness. One of the practices of the Roman Empire, which is widely discussed, right, and that it's people don't realize how brutal it was infanticide. Infanticide, right? In Rome, the landowning, you had to be a landowner to be a Roman citizen. So only people who owned land were citizens. And the land-owning Roman citizen, the patrician or plebeian, he was the head of his household. And when a baby was born in his household, whether from one of his wives, right, or whether from one of his slaves, the father of the household, the patriarch of the household, the landowner, the man who was in charge of the house, the baby would be presented to him. And there was a ceremony where the father would either choose to accept the baby or he would choose not to accept it. For every baby that was born, a slave woman had a baby, he chose whether or not to accept it. Yeah, one of his wives had a baby, he chose whether or not to accept it. If the baby was in any way deformed, Roman law required that he not accept it. And the baby would be thrown into the river or left in the middle of the woods or disposed of, right? But it could be that the father just didn't have enough money. He just didn't feel like having a baby, so they would just get rid of it. And if the father wanted the baby, he would accept it. There was this ceremony where the father would then take the baby was accepted. But if the baby was deformed in any way, if the father just didn't have enough money, they would just kill the baby. They would just, throw it in the river, leave it around. It's horrendous. Can you imagine? Can you imagine this? Infanticide, just killing babies, was an everyday thing that happened in Rome. Newborn babies would be ripped from their mother's arms and killed. That was something that happened every day in the Roman Empire. Now, can you imagine a more evil society than that? It's absolutely horrendous. And not only did this happen every day, but if the baby was in any way deformed, if there was anything wrong with the baby, if it didn't have all 5 fingers and all 5 toes, and you were a Roman man, and you didn't kill it, then you would get the death penalty. They would hang you. Right? It was some weird eugenics or something that they, so if there was a deformed baby and you let it live, you got the death penalty. So that's how, insane the Romans were, right? It was a really brutal, ruthless society. And they went around the world plundering people. right? And of course, they're trying to build up their empire with all their loot. They bring in lots of people to work on their plantations, right? They had huge plantations to grow crops, and they had huge mines to extract natural resources, metal from the earth, the metals for their swords and spears. And so they needed lots of slaves, and they needed more and more slaves, and they were going all over the world gathering people to be their slaves. And because they needed people to, make their blacksmiths to make their swords, and they needed pipe fitters to, make their pipes, and they needed, people to teach them different languages and all of that. They imported a lot of proletarians, a lot of Greeks, a lot of Jewish Palestinians came to Rome to do, to be proletarians. So people from all over the world were coming there. Now, officially, the Romans had some gods that they worshipped, right? They worshipped Jupiter, right? Jupiter was the king of the gods. Their religion, their official religion, was ripped off from Greek religion. They just gave the ancient Greek gods their own names, like Ares, the god of war, became Mars, right? They just gave new names to all the Greek myths. They ripped off their religion from ancient Greece. But in addition to the official gods that they worshipped, the Romans had cults. And this is, it was a big thing in Rome, is you had the cults. And this is fascinating. In Rome, right, in addition to the official gods, they had the cults. And the cults, they called them the mystery cults, right? For example, Rome had a big navy. In addition to their, infantry and their marching soldiers, they had an ocean navy, right? Well, the navy, they worshipped a specific god, a god of the ocean. And to go with the worshiping of the god of the ocean, the navy had its own specific beliefs that were secret, that other people in Rome didn't know. Only people in the navy knew these secret rituals that the people in the navy did to worship the god of the ocean. And other people weren't allowed to know it, right? And when you joined the Roman navy, you took an oath and you learned elaborate secret rituals to worship the god of the ocean. Furthermore, they began importing different gods from around the empire. There was a god from Persia, I believe, called Mithras. They worshipped ancient Egyptian deities, right? Like, in ancient Egypt, they had all their deities. And so one thing that was always happening in Rome was people would get bored of worshiping the regular Roman gods. And so a new god would come from some part of the empire, and the Romans would have a cult, and they would worship this god from somewhere else. And a lot of times they would find somebody from Africa or Egypt or Greece or Persia or Europe and bring them in, and that person would be kind of the guru who would tell them all about this new god from somewhere else, and the Romans would do elaborate rituals to worship this god. And so it's a very, very bizarre thing that went on, right? Usually you think of empires having like an official state religion, and Rome kind of had that, but they got kind of sick and tired of all the, the different official gods of Rome, so they were always importing all these cults, right? And there were a lot of these cults in Rome, and some of them caught on, and some of them didn't. And there were many different cults in Rome because the Romans were unsatisfied. Now, among Romans, there were two schools of thought, among, property-owning Romans, among citizens of Rome. Among the patricians and plebeians, you had two schools of thought. The primary school of thought, that was the biggest school of thought at the beginning of the empire, was called hedonism. Hedonism, and it was the idea that pleasure is the highest good, right? That the goal is to attain pleasure. And the Romans were really into pleasure. They the cult of Dionysus, right? The god from Greece, the cult of Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of sexual orgies and overeating, right? And that they would have these really elaborate parties to worship Dionysus, where they would all have sex with each other. One practice that was very common in Rome was eating to the point of vomiting and then eating more, right? The Emperor Claudius was famous. He had a servant who had a really big, long feather. And Claudius would stuff his face full of food. And then, after he had stuffed his face full of food, the servant with the feather would come and shove the feather right down his throat, tickle him, and he would barf it all up, and then go and stuff his face and eat even more food. The Romans were one of the first societies in history to believe that being fat, being fat was a good thing. Now, someone says the vomitorium thing is a myth. No. There is a mistranslation, right? There is a hallway in Roman stadiums called a vomitory. And that's a mistranslation. But the practice of Romans vomiting at their parties was very common. They just didn't do it in rooms called vomitories. That's a mistranslation. Okay, so that's let's clear that up. But it was very common for the Romans to do that, even though this was a time when most of humanity was malnourished. Most of humanity was malnourished at that time. They had statues of the Roman emperors would try to emphasize how fat they were because they thought being fat was like a noble trait. Um, Pleasure was the highest good, sex orgies, etc. That was the Roman Empire. Just a very evil society. And thank you for the super chat. Just a very evil society in many, many ways. It was an imperialist society, very, very evil. You had the hedonists. But also among the Romans, you had some people that were just too damn smart to be hedonists, right? And that exists. There's some people that just, hey, the orgies and the gladiatorial shows where they watch people kill each other, slaves kill each other, and watching lions eat each other, and or watching the chariot races, or having sex, all day long or whatever. There's some Romans that just wanted more out of life than that. They weren't able to just be to be hedonists. Right? They just couldn't do it. So among the Romans who weren't satisfied with hedonism, you had what were called Stoics. And that was like your smarter Romans who wanted more out of life. They were looking for enlightenment. And the Stoics, they would usually follow one of these cults that was imported. They would follow philosophers and philosophical teachers like Seneca. Seneca was probably the most famous Stoic philosopher. And these Romans who were Stoics, they weren't hedonists, they rejected hedonism. Instead of celebrating pleasure as the highest good, they saw suffering as the highest good. They wanted to control themselves. They would fast, they would starve themselves, right? To show that they had the strength to starve themselves. They would whip themselves, right? They would whip themselves. They had elaborate rituals involving whipping, like sadomasochism. Right? They would have sadomasochistic punishment, dominatrix kind of stuff going on. They would take drugs and hallucinogens, right? That was a thing that the Romans did, and induce hallucinations to find beauty. And a lot of times these philosophers that would come to Rome and be Stoic philosophers were con men and charlatans. And they would kind of appeal to Romans' guilt. A lot of Romans knew that something was wrong with their empire, knew that there was more to life than pleasure, knew that these sex orgies and these, gladiatorial shows and this stuffing food down your face, that wasn't the place to find satisfaction. There was more to life. And so a lot of Romans felt kind of guilt. Deep down, they just felt like something wasn't right. So these Stoic philosophers came along and ripped them off, basically, and took advantage of the Romans' guilt, and would set up these little cults where the Romans would whip themselves and take drugs and starve themselves and give all their money to one of these philosophers. And there's actually Roman comedies making fun of these Roman philosophers. People compare them to like the televangelists now, right? Who they get on there and they say, if you love Jesus, send me all your money. Send me all your money and I will, it was basically that, right? Except that, it wasn't just give me all your money. It was give me all your money, whip yourself, take some drugs. And so they had these philosophical con men, these stoicists who went around, appealing to the Romans who knew there was something wrong with the hedonism. Tolstoy. Who knew there was something wrong with the hedonism. That was the role. That was what you could be in Rome. You could be a hedonist or a stoicist. Okay? And that was Roman society. What happened over the course of the Roman Empire was at the beginning, the hedonists had the upper hand. In the beginning, Rome was dominated by hedonists. But over the course of the Roman Empire, gradually the stoicists got the upper hand, right? Eventually, in the final years of Rome, they eventually outlawed infanticide, right? And they got to the point that Romans didn't want to fight in the military anymore. And gradually, Roman society got so weary of the hedonism, so weary of the wars, that stoicism kind of became more and more common. As Rome was in decline, it became more and more stoic. Charles Dickens. It became more and more of a stoicist society. That's interesting, right? It started out as a hedonist society with all this cruelty and all of that. Was Imperial Japan, and it gradually became a Stoicist society. Now, how does Christianity fit in with all of this? Right? How does Christianity fit in with all of this? Well, Christianity, it started out in Jerusalem, followers of somebody named Jesus, anti-Roman, Jews. Some of them somehow got to Rome, right? Whether they were carpenters or bricklayers, or there were some proletarians from Palestine who got to Rome. And in Rome, the proletarians were fighting for their rights, right? In addition to having the first proletarians in Rome, you had the first strikes. What is a strike? A strike would be, when the Romans weren't paying a fair wage to carpenters, all the carpenters would get together and they would form something called a guild or a union. And they would say, none of us are going to work unless they agree to pay all of us a fair wage. Solidarity. An injury to one is an injury to all. And in Rome, among the skilled craftsmen, among the proletarians, they realized the Romans were going to rip them off. And the only way they could demand better treatment is they would go on strike. They would go on strike. And all of the bricklayers would say to all the Romans, we are not going to lay bricks until you guys promise to pay all of us a decent wage. They formed guilds, unions. You had labor unions that were formed. Labor unions among the proletarians. It was a big deal, right? Because the proletarians had nothing to sell but their labor power. They had no property. And so it happened. Rosenbergs, thank you for the super chat. Very important question. And they would go on strike. And of course, the Romans didn't like that. They didn't like having proletarians, so they outlawed unions. But of course, they would still organize unions in secret. I mean, you can't really outlaw something. You had populists or populares, like Julius Caesar, who were politicians who would rally the proletarians. They would gain strength from having the proletarians. And the Gracchi brothers and other figures in Rome, they were people from the landowning classes that realized they could gain strength in Roman society by having a mob of proletarians on their side, right? And that's the populists or the populares. You had populists who fought for the proletarians. But among the proletarians themselves, as they formed their guilds and they fought for their rights, they started worshiping, first only among Jewish proletarians, they started worshiping a carpenter named Jesus, right? Jesus was a proletarian. He was a carpenter, right? Jesus was not a slave. Jesus was not a landowner. He was a proletarian. He was a carpenter. And among the proletarians, they started worshiping as part of their guild practices, as part of their early labor union activity. They started worshiping an ancient carpenter who lived in Jerusalem, who was, they believed, the Son of God. And this is how Christianity in Rome, modern Christianity, really began. And it began among proletarians in Rome. Were Celts socialists? Worshipping a carpenter son of God, who was fighting for the Jews. I mean, it was Jewish proletarians, right? And they believed that there had been this great Jewish carpenter who lived in Palestine, and the Romans had killed him, but he had risen from the dead, and that one day he would return and overthrow the Roman Empire. And that's the most important thing. Read the book of Revelations. Right? The book of Revelations. I remember being a kid and asking the, it's funny, my grandmother was a Lutheran, and I would, every summer I would go to vacation Bible school with my Lutheran grandmother, and I remember asking about the book of Revelations. And I remember the Lutheran minister at the vacation Bible school saying that, well, the book of Revelations was a secret code for the church in Rome. And that's what Catholics will tell you. And that's the standard non-evangelical interpretation. It wasn't really until the 1800s people decided that the book of Revelations in the Bible was about the end times. That's a very new interpretation. It's about the end of the world, Armageddon, etc. But, I mean, it was understood at the time that the book of Revelations was published, right? The last book of the Bible, the Revelation to John, right? That someone named John, probably not John the Apostle, but John, they call him John the Revelator, right? Some early Christian, right? At the point that the church had already been established in Rome and in Alexandria and other places, a Christian named John went to the Greek island of Patmos, and on the Greek island of Patmos, he apparently had some kind of vision, and that vision was written down, and that is the final book of the Bible. It is the book of Revelations. And it's gobbledygook, right? You read it, it's the seven kings and the seven trumpets and the four horsemen and all kinds of numbers, and it doesn't make any sense. And you look at it and it looks like a bunch of gibberish. You read it, and it doesn't, I mean, it's what does it mean? I mean, it looks like a bunch of gibberish, right? And, the evangelicals have their conspiracy theories about it. There's some people who won't take the vaccine, right? And they think it's the sign of the beast. And, every time there's fighting in the Middle East, they think that means that the end of times is coming. But if you read what the book of Revelations was, most likely, it was a call and it was a prediction about how the Christians would organize to overthrow the Roman Empire. That's really what the book of Revelations was. It was them talking about how they would overthrow the Roman Empire. And one part of the book of Revelations that is very, very important, I think. All the people, they always talk about the number of the beast, 666, and all of that. Well, if you read that particular passage, it says that the beast, the Antichrist, shall require all to have a mark on their hand or on their forehead, and none can buy or sell without the mark. What that is a reference to is how the Romans ruled the world. What I've been explaining about how the Roman Empire worked, right? All roads lead to Rome. They were the middleman in global trade. No one could do business without the Romans. And that's what that was clearly a reference to. The Antichrist was the Roman emperor, and nobody could do business without going through him. They all had to have the mark, the number of the beast, the mark, in order to do business. That's what it was a reference to, right? It was a reference to how the Roman Empire worked, right? And if you read how the Antichrist talks, he talks about money and financial transactions. He's some ruler who rules the entire world. It's clear that the image of the Antichrist in the book of Revelations, it's pretty clear that it's the Roman Empire. Now, what's even more interesting, though, is that there's a whole rant about the whore of Babylon, right? And that's a big section of the book of Revelations. They go on and on about the whore of Babylon. And it's somebody who's considered the great whore or whatever, and she's killed in awful ways, and she's tortured for her treachery. What that was probably a reference to is what I'm getting to here. So I mentioned that, among proletarians in Rome, they started secretly worshiping, Jesus, and Christianity existed as a religion among early Roman proletarians, that it eventually stopped being for Jews only, right? And you can read the Apostle Paul, there's whole letters where they talk about how you can be circumcised in the spirit and how, it stopped being a religion just for Jews. And it became a religion that anyone could convert to, but it was illegal in Rome. And if you were a Christian, you got fed to the lions or you got executed. They considered it to be an anti-Roman religion because the Christian religion talked about overthrowing the Roman Empire. It talked about how the proletarians would rise up and overthrow the landowners and how they would, the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It was a revolutionary movement of proletarians, and they organized unions and strikes. And they didn't like it. The Romans, the Roman Empire didn't much care for that. So it was something you couldn't practice. But as Christianity existed in Rome for, a couple hundred years, it started to change. Right? One thing that the Christians did was they organized orphanages. Right? In Rome, they had this big problem with all these homeless children. Well, the Christians, because they were proletarians, organized, they pooled their money, and they built orphanages for the homeless children. And the Roman leaders, as much as they hated the Christians, they liked that. They said, oh, wow, they kind of solved our homeless kids problem, didn't they? They just built orphanages. Well, golly. And, when people would be starving out on the street in Rome, they used to always have bread riots, right? Where if there was a shortage, if there was, a lot of people unemployed and hungry, they'd go out and riot and burn things down. Well, the Christians, the proletarians, would come together and give free food away to people. And the Romans noticed that, and they said, wow, these Christians are giving everybody free food, and now we don't have bread riots as much, and now we've solved our homeless food problem. And so among the Roman elite, there started to be an attitude like maybe Christianity isn't so bad. Like maybe there are some things we can learn from the Christians that'll make our empire work better, right? This whole proletarians rising up and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. Yeah, we don't want that, right? This whole, but maybe there's some aspects of this Christian thing that will make our empire work better. And so you had a divide in the Christian church. And you had the legal Christian church that was legalized by the Romans, and you had the illegal Christian church. The ones who maintained the revolutionary teachings, they were the illegal Christian church. But the ones who gave up the revolutionary teachings and instead just ran orphanages and fed poor people and helped make Rome more efficient, they became the legal Christian church. So you had a legal Christian church and an illegal Christian church. The whore of Babylon in the book of Revelations, pages and pages and pages about the whore of Babylon. What that was about, that was the illegal Christian church, the ones who still believed in the overthrow of the Roman Empire, who still wanted to tear apart the Roman Empire, ranting against the legal Christian church, who they saw as the sellouts, as the compromisers, right? And that's a huge section of the book of Revelations. They're going on and on about the whore of Babylon, right? The great whore, right? And it's an analogy, it's not a very sensitive way to do that. We don't want to demonize sex workers, etc. But it was a reference to the Romans and thank you, Nathan. It was a reference to the Romans who were collaborating and had adjusted Christianity to basically not be revolutionary anymore, right? And there's the line that comes from the book of Revelations that people interpret as being very anti-Semitic, where it says that it says something like, there are those who say they are Jews but are not Jews, and they are the synagogue of Satan. And what that referred to is it referred to this sellout wing of the Christian church who say that they are following Christianity, but are not. And so these phonies, it argues, are the synagogue of Satan. That's what it's referring to, right? It's those Christians that claim to be following Christ, but aren't. They are satanic. And that's who the great whore is. And there's a whole section of the book of Revelation about killing the great whore, right? And she'll be punished, and she's awful. And then, how does the book of Revelations end? It has Christ returning, and Christ, returns, and all who refused to take the mark of the beast, right? Those who could not buy or sell anything, right? Because in order to buy or sell anything, you had to take the mark of the beast. So those who couldn't buy or sell anything, why not? Because they had no property. Those proletarians, those who didn't take the mark of the beast, right, couldn't buy or sell anything because they had no property, and refused to denounce the name of Christ, reigned for 1,000 years, right? And the book of Revelations in the Bible is very much an angry manifesto written at a time when Christianity was starting to become legal in the Roman Empire. That's basically what the book of Revelations is. And the Romans were taking Christianity, watering it down, and using it to make their empire more stable, right? That, we don't have homeless children on the street. We don't have bread riots. And Christianity was being changed in order to accommodate the Roman Empire. And eventually, you'll know that, Constantine, the emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity. Now, the story is that supposedly Emperor Constantine, he had a dream, and in the dream he saw the cross in the sky, and this booming voice said to him, "Under this sign you shall conquer." And so he woke up and converted to Christianity. We now know, however, that it was actually his mother, that the mother of Constantine, his mother had already been a secret Christian. So he was converted to Christianity by his mother. Loving this info. I mean, it is taught. Karl Kautsky, Elaine Pagels, other people, this is widely understood. So, so he converted to Christianity. And the Romans realized that one great thing about Christianity is that Christianity is a monotheistic religion. Christianity says there's only one God. And one of the problems they'd had is that they were constantly people in different areas rising up against them who had different gods, right? You know, the Germans would revolt against the Romans in the name of their god, their god Odin, right? There would be Odinist uprisings among the Germans, right? The Greeks would rise up against the Romans in the name of their gods, right? The Egyptians would rise up, and the Persians would rise up. So the Romans figured out, hey, if we can forcibly convert everyone to this watered down version of Christianity, if we can forcibly convert everyone to that, they can't have their own gods. And in fact, we can set up a Christianity that's centered around our empire, where we determine, what is real Christianity or not. So the Romans converted their empire to Christianity and killed anybody who wouldn't convert to Christianity as an effort to try and save their empire, right? Okay, our empire is falling apart. Every area is going this way and that way. So we're going to forcibly convert everyone to Christianity, number one. And we're going to make sure that the only form of Christianity that is allowed is our version, our watered-down version. And so that's basically, you have the Roman Empire converting to Christianity, the very religion that had started out as a religion to overthrow them. The Book of Revelations is a proto-Marxist Lenin. Okay, all right, let me write that down. That they adopt the beliefs of a revolutionary movement that was meant to overthrow them. They water them down, they distort them, and they turn it into a vehicle with which to try and save their empire. And what's particularly interesting is that it didn't work, right? And as the Roman elite, as the ruling class of Rome became Christian, Christianity became less and less revolutionary, and it actually became more and more influenced by Stoicism, right? Many people, it's very cliche among internet atheists, they will point out the similarity between the life of Jesus and the legends of various Roman Stoic philosophers, right? And there's a reason for that, which was that Christianity was becoming more and more like the Roman Stoic tradition, right? And the Roman Stoics were talking about being nice to people and being kind. It wasn't a revolutionary movement at all. The Stoics were just about be nice, think about other people, live for the sake of other people. They were trying to make the Roman Empire kinder and gentler. And so the Stoics, they enacted some pretty big reforms. They outlawed infanticide, right? Infanticide had been a huge part of Roman society from the beginning, but, as Christianity moved in, they outlawed infanticide. You couldn't kill babies anymore. What else did they do? They got to the point that the Stoicists and the Christians were so dominant, but it wasn't, this revolutionary Christianity that had begun. It was this watered down, soft, be kind to one another, Christianity that had been adopted. And it got to the point that Romans didn't want to join the military anymore. Right? Rome, the very thing that had made Rome this big, mighty empire was that they had this big, huge military. Well, it got to the point that after Rome was so stoicist and so Christian that Romans didn't want to join the military anymore. The Romans didn't like war. And so in the final years of Rome, after they've converted their empire to Christianity, after the hedonists are in decline, the Stoicists are taking over, the Germans, who have been converted to Christianity now, they're no longer worshiping Odin. The Germans, the barbarians, they called them, the Vandals and the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths started revolting against the Romans. And the Romans couldn't get an army together to defeat the Germans. So what they did is they spent money going and hiring other Germans to kill the Germans. You can read about this, that as Rome was falling apart in all the different regions of the Roman Empire, you had revolts taking place, and the Romans can't get an army that's strong enough to defeat them, so they gather their money and go to their neighbors and nearby people and give them money to go and kill the other people revolting against them. And they're depending on mercenaries. They have an entire mercenary army in their final ends. And this is how Rome ultimately collapsed. And actually, one of the most important books in the history of Christianity was The City of God by St. Augustine. And the City of God by St. Augustine is all about, it's basically St. Augustine answering, why did Rome fall at the same time it adopted Christianity? Because, St. Augustine was trying to convert people all over the world to Christianity. And it was a little bit of an embarrassing point. And a bit of an embarrassing point that at the same time that Rome converted to Christianity, it fell. Right? So he writes this whole book about, it doesn't matter, the city of God is in the future. It's a hugely big point of embarrassment. So what's interesting is the Christianity that existed in Europe, the Christianity that really exists in the world today, is largely a product of the Romans taking what began as a revolutionary movement of proletarians to overthrow their empire, adopting it, watering it down, changing it in order to serve their empire. That's basically what it is. China's... Okay. That's basically what it is. That is basically what it is. That's what it is. It's already on the list, Dust. It's on the list as a super chat, but I will put a check mark next to it since you're the second person to ask about that. And what's interesting is if you look at what Marxism is, right? You read Frederick Engels, the principles of communism. He's asked, what is communism, is the first question. He says, communism is the doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat. That's what communism is, the doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat. Well, that's basically what Christianity began as. Christianity in Rome began as a doctrine for the liberation of the proletariat. It was a religious doctrine, right? Marxism is a scientific doctrine. But what Christianity began as is what communism is today. The doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat, right? In Rome, the proletarians fought for their liberation, organized unions and guilds, fought for their rights, talked about overthrowing the empire, and they had Christianity, this cult that worshipped a carpenter from Jerusalem, who they believed was going to come back and lead them to overthrow the empire. That was what it was. And what happened? As the Roman Empire was in decline, it started adopting and watering down Christianity to try and use it to stabilize their empire. And what is social democracy? Social democracy is that, right? That's imperialism. As Western capitalism and imperialism is in decline, they take aspects of Marxism and they water it down in an attempt to make their empire work better. That's basically what it is. Social democracy, right? Bernie Sanders, the British Labour Party, the French Socialist Party, the German Social Democratic Party, the DNC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? They're not communists. They're not revolutionaries, but they say something that sounds kind of similar. And this is the imperialists taking something from Marxism, watering it down, and trying to use it to make their empire more stable. Right? That's basically what we can learn from Christianity. Christianity was a revolutionary proletarian movement, and it was basically, it was watered down and adopted as the Roman Empire's religion in an attempt to save the Roman Empire that did not work. Well, that's basically what social democracy is. Social democracy is an attempt to water down communism, water down Marxism, and apply it in a way that will make the empire more stable. The ultra-rich, much like the Emperor Constantine, they think that, the empire, the U.S. imperialist empire, would work better if people had health care, right? It would make society a little more stable. If we addressed issues around race and we didn't, have blatant racism against people of color, it would make our empire more stable. So the ultra-rich are moving in a kind of social democratic direction, not because they want to get rid of the empire, not because they want to get rid of capitalism, but because they think that offering some concessions will make it more stable. Meanwhile, most of the most of the people in most of the people in the US ruling class, most of the bourgeoisie don't want that. They just want maximum profits. So you have a struggle between what I call the entrepreneurial bourgeoisie that just want to make profits and the managerial bourgeoisie that are willing to have stabilization measures. That means we have to give some people some health care. If that means we have to, this is basically what's going on, right? What happened in the Roman Empire as a form of religious struggle between Christianity and the Roman religion is happening today in a political struggle between communism and social democracy and regular American capitalism and libertarianism. That's basically what's going on. So if you want to understand why I, as a communist, as somebody who is very much a Marxist-Leninist, someone who is very much an adherent of dialectical materialism, why do I call myself a Christian? Why do I take so much inspiration from the Bible? It's because I understand that communism is the doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat, and that Christianity began as the doctrine of the liberation of the proletariat. And basically, if you want to be an ancient Roman Christian in 21st century America, you need to become a communist, right? That it's the same ultimate movement. I don't know who that is. I've never heard of that. It's basically the same movement. Now, I have to say this, okay? And this must be said, okay, to conclude what I'm saying here. And then we'll go to the roll call, and I'll answer the super chat questions. I must say this, that, if you read the book of Revelations, if you read the Christian Gospels, right? In the book of Matthew, Jesus Christ says to his followers, he says, I come not to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. I come to turn a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a son-in-law against his father-in-law. A man's enemies shall be those of his own household. And he who loves his mother or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves his son or his father more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take up his cross is not worthy of me. And whoever gains his life shall lose it. And whoever loses his life for my sake shall gain it. Right? It's very powerful stuff. And it's very clear that he's building some kind of revolutionary movement. He's building a group of people, right? You read the part where he sends his followers out as sheep among wolves, right? I mean, he was building a revolutionary movement. You read the Great Commission. Thank you, David Fox. And one of the weaknesses, I will say, and Marx himself talks about this, the weaknesses, like Bay of Pigs. Thank you, David Fox. One of the weaknesses of Marxism that Marx himself admitted was a hole in his philosophy is what you can call economic determinism. Economic determinism. Karl Marx, I believe there is a letter he wrote to Friedrich Engels, and he said, why are we here? Our philosophy says we shouldn't be here, right? According to Marxism, it just all kind of naturally works out, right? It's in the economic interest of the bourgeoisie to overthrow feudalism. Then it's in the interest of the proletariat to overthrow the bourgeoisie. Everyone just kind of acts according to, oh, okay, good for you, Bob. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that guy. Everything just kind of naturally works. People work in their economic interest, and history just kind of naturally works. And so Karl Marx says, why am I writing this? Why am I writing these books? Why are we doing this activism? Why are we forming the International Working Men's Association? What's the point? It all just naturally happens. Historical inevitability, economic determinism. Karl Marx is writing this, and he's saying something's up here, because my philosophy basically says there's no room for free will. There's no room for individual heroism and sacrifice. And that is actually a very valid criticism of the Marxist philosophy. It's a very, very valid criticism. Because if you look at it, history requires people who do things that are not in their direct economic interest. Che Guevara was from a very wealthy family, but he gave it all up to be a revolutionary. and to go out and die on the battlefield. And even after he won the Cuban Revolution, he went to Bolivia and died on the battlefield. Right? Think about Mao. He was from a peasant middle-class family. He was college educated. He didn't have to go out in the countryside and start a revolutionary movement of the people. He could have been a nice, comfortable professor. He could have been a high school principal like he was, but Mao said, oh no, I'm going to go out into the countryside. I'm going to organize the peasantry. I'm going to lead this huge people's war. I'm going to go on the Long March. Why did he do that? Why? Right? I mean, you read about so many great people. You read about the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You read about Malcolm X. You read about William Z. Foster and Gus Hall. Why did these people do that, right? According to Marxism, nobody should just be heroic. You don't need heroes. Everyone just kind of does what's in their economic interest. But they don't. They don't do what's in their economic interest, right? That's what drives us Marxists so crazy, is that we go through the world and we see so many people who have, wool over their eyes and they let the capitalists rip them off and rob them blind. There's false consciousness everywhere. And that we have learned over the course of the history of Marxism, over the course of the last 200 years, that there is a spiritual drive. There is a spiritual drive. There is a spiritual power behind revolutionary movements that cannot be explained in terms of dialectical materialism. There is something that drives people to fight and be dedicated and to act heroically that cannot be explained in terms of their basic material economic interests. There is an inner force, an inner strength that people are able to call upon to act above their own economic interests, to demand what is right, to mobilize people to fight, to be on the right side of history. There is a spiritual component to our movement. And part of the reason that Christianity caught on, I am convinced, is because this ancient Roman carpenter, or this ancient Jerusalem, Jewish carpenter, whatever it was, tapped into something in his followers, tapped into something in them beyond just their economic interest. There's a reason that so many Christians were willing to get fed to the lions, right, and martyred for the faith. There's a reason that, and that there is some kind of spiritual edge to what we are doing as a movement. There is something beyond direct material interest. And largely, that is what has made Christianity catch on. When people see the martyrdom and, the killing of Jesus Christ and the sacrifice, it's a very, very powerful story that speaks to people, that says to them, look at this person who gave his life for his beliefs, could suffer such a horrendous death. And look how, even in death, he became immortal. He became immortal. He became immortalized, right? He rose from the dead. And, there's something that speaks to people about that. The concept of revolutionary immortality. You can find that in Christianity. I don't know. I'm not managing the chat. You can find revolutionary immortality in Christianity, right? You can find a desire to live for something higher than yourself. You can find the spirit and the relentlessness of humanity. It's very, very beautiful. And there is something spiritual about that. And perhaps maybe the mistake that we made. At the time that Karl Marx was living, right? 1860s, 1850s, 1870s, everything had to be scientific. Science was new. Spiritual thinking, religion, that had been around for a long time. But if you wanted something to be modern, you called it scientific. Freudian psychoanalysis is not really scientific. But it called itself that because it was new. All kinds of things were around that everyone, if you wanted something, you wanted to sell something, you had to call it, if you wanted something to be new and modern, you called it scientific. And Marxism really bent over backwards to insist that it was a strictly scientific movement. It was not a spiritual movement. It had no superstitions. It was not religious. But if you look at revolutionary movements around the world, they do pull a religious energy out of people. People are dedicated to making sacrifices, right? People do draw inner strength. They do draw inner power from something spiritual. So that is why I, as a Marxist, as a communist, that is why I consider myself to also be a Christian, because I see in Christianity what Marx was talking about, that revolutionary energy, that strength of an individual, that morality. That's what I see in Christianity, and that's why I, as a Marxist, identify as a Christian, as I look to spread the notion that the working class should control society and the banks, factories, and industries should be organized for public good and not profits. And that's why I do it. So, Sunday will be Easter. Tonight is Good Friday. It's also the last night of Passover. It's also many different holidays to many different people. So that's all I wanted to give you in my opening remarks. So there you go. That's my opening remarks for you tonight. Hope you enjoyed it. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Names and locations. Calgary, Canada. Brazil. Pennsylvania, USA. Justin Wooten in Beijing, China. Welcome, Justin. Los Angeles. T in China. Welcome, T in China. Bay Area. Very good. Nassau County. Char Darling. Chris Hedges is a good Christian too. JT24, Mississippi. Cleveland, Texas. Wilmington, Delaware. Maryland, Parasocialite. Clydebank. Australia. Adelaide. Alex from upstate New York. Missouri. United Corporations of America. Danny from Eureka. Ryan in Oakland, California. Springfield, Missouri. Ancient Rome. New York City. Branson, Missouri. Northern California. San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Los Angeles. Southern California, Oshkosh, Wisconsin, Ottawa, Canada, Berkeley, San Angelo, Solidarity. Shout out to those folks in San Angelo. They do great work. They're doing great work for their community out there. Effingham, Illinois, Australia, Cascadia, Dante and Santa Barbara, Philly and San Diego, New York City, Queens, Putting the Red in West Virginia, Cincinnati, Ohio, West Palm Beach, Hawaii. Keep up your great work. Appreciate from Texas. Very good. Berlin, Alameda, California, Macedonia, West Palm Beach, California, Berlin, Wisconsin, Austin from California, Matt in San Antonio, secret communist base on Mars. Very good. West Palm Beach, Seattle. Currently in Sydney visiting the folks, says David. Well, have a good visit. Kieran from San Diego, Albany, New York, Lee County, North Carolina. Great intro. Blue Islands, Illinois. It's only Western Christian Good Friday. That's true. Eastern Orthodox is next month. Springfield, Missouri. Nathan and his cat in Beijing, soon to be Shanghai. Shout out to you, Nathan. Always good to have you here. Utah, Sussex, UK. Charles from Ottawa, West Palm Beach, Kabul, West Palm Beach. Nathan, Pankau, DDD, West Palm Beach, Hawaii, Madrid. Patrick from Los Angeles, California Republic, Corona, California, Detroit, Michigan, Columbus, Ohio, the Grassy Knoll, Springfield, Missouri, Albany, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, South Korea, Joe Gale in Nassau County, good friend of the program, Thailand, Baltimore, Swedish imperialism, Illinois, Quebec, Canada. Very, very good. Very, very good. Vancouver, British Columbia. Anybody else want me to call them out names and locations? And we'll start going through these super chats. All right. Melbourne, Florida, and Melbourne, Australia. Sydney, Australia. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Houston, Texas. Very good. Very, 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 very good. Al-Quds, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Very, very, very good. All righty, folks. Let's start answering David in China. All right. Let's answer these super chat questions. Why are there so many pro-life Republican Christians in the United States? Well, I'm going to answer that question in an indirect way. I mean, obviously, the obvious answer to that is that, Christianity is the major religion in the United States. Republicans tend to be more traditional in terms of U.S. society. So, if you're more traditional in the United States, you're more Republican, and so you're also going to be more Christian, as that's the biggest religion in the United States. That's the basic answer. But there's more to it than that, which is, I talked about this before, and it's really important. I grew up, in Ohio in the 1990s. I was surrounded by what you can call the religious right, the evangelical Christians. Now, we've always had Christianity in the U.S. society, but the religious right, the evangelical Christian right, the Mike Pence people, that stuff started in the 1970s. And that's a particular the mega church phenomenon, that stuff is something that is a specific trend in U.S. history. What happened was, TV changed America's mind, right? I mean, TV is a huge invention. It changed U.S. society drastically, right? Everyone had world events shown to them in their living room. And TV changed, and McCarthyism used the TV. McCarthyism used TV, right? Americans, we thought the Soviets were our friends during World War II, but we all of a sudden we had this talking box in our home that scared the crap out of us. Oh my God, there was communists under every bed and every rock, and they're going to invade, they're going to nuke us, and TV psyched up the American people for McCarthyism, scared the crap out of Americans, and got Americans who had liked communists and liked the labor movement and liked Roosevelt to be wild, fanatical anti-communists, right? They got brainwashed by TV. But, because the anti-communism spun out of control, and you had like the U.S. Army being accused of being communists and all kinds of crazy stuff happening. There was a member of Congress who committed suicide because he was blackmailed by Joe McCarthy. And so what happened? TV undid McCarthyism. Edward R. Murrow and American TV turned against McCarthy, Joe McCarthy, and ruined his reputation, and he drank himself to death. And the liberals had the upper hand. Starting in the late 50s, early 60s, the liberals had the upper hand on American TV. And it was the liberals who had the upper hand. And, the Beatles, right? Beatles, rock and roll musicians, right? Where did rock and roll music come from? Well, rock and roll is based on African American spiritual music, right? African American spiritual music, eventually you get blues out of that, and eventually you get rock music. That's where rock and roll came from. And, rock and roll music, it was originally among African Americans. It was praise music, and then you had the blues and all of that. But, in American Pentecostal churches, right? Pentecostalism is a form of Christianity. They talk about charismatic Christianity, where people, they shake and they believe that God comes into the room when they're praying, and they shake violently, and and their music was different than other Christian music, mainly because it was about kind of inducing a trance state. It was more hypnotic, right? Regular hymns, church hymns don't do that. But Pentecostalism, and it soon spread, as white people were doing this too, they would get kind of hypnotized in the church service. They'd be shaking and yelling and speaking in tongues, and all of that was going on. And that was like an American religious tradition. Was that, you had among working class people, it started out with black people, but also among white people, you had these religious practices where people would start speaking in tongues. They would handle snakes. They would handle poisonous snakes. They would light themselves on fire. They would get into a trance state. You'd have heavy drums playing, and people would, and it was, perhaps it was inspired by some African traditional practices, and it was a religious trend in U.S. society among working class people where people would get into kind of hypnotic states as they were praying, and they would use African American like spiritual music, but with a heavy drum beat. That's where rock music comes from. So the Beatles came along, and the Beatles, it was rock. It was basically this kind of religious music without the religion involved. I'm sorry, what's that? Thoughts on Israeli elections. It was this kind of religious music without the religion involved. Okay? The Beatles, the Beatles would have these big concerts, and the Beatles toured the United States. And they toured the United States, and they went to Tennessee, and they went to Memphis, and they went to Alabama, and they toured the United States, and it scared the crap out of a lot of religious people, because people, these auditoriums would be full of teenagers who liked the Beatles, liked their music, and the Beatles would do the exact same thing that Pentecostal pastors would do, right? They would, the Beatles would be there and they'd be singing Twist and Shout or whatever. But the Beatles, they had figured out how to get their audience watch the videos. Beatlemania, right? Beatlemania, where the crowds of teenage girls are chasing the Beatles, right? And those, you watch those videos, they're getting their audience into a trance state. The girls are all screaming and crying and moving back and forth, and they're able to induce a hypnotic trance state from their audience, but there's no religion involved. And that scared that's why, like you see all these things of, of like pastors would burn Beatles albums and say that rock and roll was satanic. Well, it scared the crap out of them, because what they would do at their church services in order to prove they were, this kind of, you could almost call it sorcery or magic that they would do to get their audience to think they were God, or to think that their religion was correct. now the Beatles could do, and so it was like a threat to them. So that's, and the Beatles were pushing kind of a new left message, right? The Beatles protested the Vietnam War. The Beatles, it was associated with more liberal views about sexuality and such. So you had kind of a feeling among middle America that rock and roll and all of that was a threat. All of this culminates in the civil rights movement and the black liberation movement and the rise of the 1960s. And, the hippie movement is very much a pushback against McCarthyism, right? With rock and roll music, with long people, growing long hair and beards. I recommend the book "The Land Where the Blues Began" by Alan Lomax. I'll have to check that book out, David. Thanks. And it's a pushback against McCarthyism. McCarthyism is very military. Everyone has short hair, and everyone's very strict and traditional. And the hippies are practicing free love and listening to rock music and growing their hair long and doing drugs. And it's a reaction to McCarthyism, right? So, among the hippies, you have a group of people they call Jesus freaks. And it was just a variant of hippies. There were all kinds of hippies. There were hippies that were really into drugs. There were hippies that were really into activism, and some became communists, Students for a Democratic Society, the Weathermen. There were hippies who were into farming, and there were hippies there were all kinds of hippies. It was just a cultural phenomenon. Basically, it was young people growing their hair long and listening to rock music. It was a cultural thing. There was one particular brand of hippie that they called Jesus freaks, and those were hippie Christians. And most of them were Roman Catholic at the beginning, right? And it was just, they were being hippies, and they were Christians. And they adopted the ichthus, the symbol of Christianity. The fish became their symbol, and they would stand on street corners and sing hymns on their guitars and talk about Jesus was like a revolutionary who believed in love, man, and whatever. It was just, they were the Jesus freaks, right? They're hippies, right? And hippie Christians, right? And it made sense. But at the time, right, TV, the Beatles, among young people, the left or liberals had the upper hand because, all the TV and all the rock music was pushing like a liberal left-wing message. So conservatives were losing out among young people. Young people didn't want to hear about Christianity. Young people were not joining churches. Young people were not joining the military. They had a draft. So the right wing is like having a huddle with Richard Nixon, and they're having a huddle. How do we get the young people back? So the spiritual advisor of Richard Nixon was Reverend Billy Graham, who was probably one of the most famous pastors in U.S. history, Reverend Billy Graham. Reverend Billy Graham talks to Richard Nixon, and he starts having Jesus freaks. Reverend Billy Graham had these broadcasts where he would give his religious message. He started having hippie Jesus freaks play songs, right? Reverend Billy Graham, he would give his sermons, but before he would, give his sermon, he would have a couple Jesus freaks with their long hair come out and, play songs on their guitars or something. And you would see long-haired Jesus freaks on Billy Graham's thing. Billy Graham was a right-wing conservative. He was an anti-Semite and said a lot of things to Richard Nixon about Jews that are not very nice. And he was certainly not a hippie, and he was certainly a supporter of the Vietnam War, but, started having Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. And there's 2 Broadway musicals that are aimed at Jesus freaks. The first is Jesus Christ Superstar by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The second is Godspell. And these are 2 Broadway musicals that they then immediately make into movies that are promoting Jesus freaks, right? And it's rock and roll music with hippie aesthetics promoting Christianity. And so, the right wing is saying, okay, well, the hippie thing is big among young people, but there's this one group of young people that are religious, and religion's a big part of what it means to be a conservative. So maybe this is like a way we can recruit young people to be conservative. So they start pouring money into Jesus freaks. And, you have the 2 Jesus freak Broadway musicals, Superstar and Godspell. Billy Graham has, Jesus freaks on his broadcasts. So then what happened is they imported Reverend Sun Myung Moon to the United States, this crazy Korean pastor, right, who believes he's the second coming of Jesus, very extreme religious beliefs, and he's a fanatical anti-communist. He's kind of a fascist, if you really look at his beliefs. He believes like Koreans are the master race, and they're going to lead. He's the second coming of Christ to unite the global Christians to wage a crusade against communism. He's tied to the dictator of South Korea, Park Chung-hee. Richard Nixon flies, Sun Myung-moon to the United States and has Sun Myung-moon start recruiting hippies, right? And he sets up these communes, and people think it's just a hippie commune, and then they get there, and it turns out they're followers of Reverend Moon. They're Moonies. What did communist parties in the Eastern Bloc lose their... Okay. So also there's a guy named Reverend Tony Alamo. And, this guy's a Beatles marketer in Los Angeles. He's like a record company exec. And he has some kind of religious experience and decides he's like a prophet of God. So he starts his, Alamo Ministries. He has a cult. And there's a bunch of them, right? And again, among the Jesus freaks, right, you have these groups that look like they're kind of left-wing groups, the Moonies, the Alamo Ministries and stuff. But when you really get to know them, they're conservative, they're Republican, they're right-wing. And so basically, it's starting to work out. And, you have conservative Christianity among Protestants kind of being reinvented to involve rock and roll music, to involve a very watered-down message. Like, people talk about the Jesus freaks are very different than traditional Christians in the United States. Traditional Christians can tell you the difference between a Presbyterian and a Methodist and a Catholic. The Jesus freaks, they sit there, it's about love, man. It's about love. I don't care none of that. It's about the Bible. It's about love, brother. Love, brother. I just love the Bible. I love Jesus. It's like Christianity for dummies, almost, right? It's like, I love Jesus. And it's like watered down, right? So, the right wing is realizing that in order to recruit young people who grew up listening to Beatles music and grew up watching television, in order to recruit them to be conservative right-wing Christians, you can't recruit them to be Presbyterians or fundamental Baptists or regular. You got to have this like watered-down, dumb rock and roll Christianity in order to get boomers, basically. In order to recruit boomers to be conservative right-wing Christians, you have to have dumb Christianity. You can't have the old, like, really complicated Christianity, right? So, by about 1978, Reverend Jerry Falwell, he becomes the voice of a whole new movement that's spreading across the United States that's like this. They play rock and roll music, they play things on guitars, and it's Christianity watered down, right? We don't know anything about Martin Luther. We don't know anything about the Reformation, man. It's about love, brother. Jesus loves you. He loves you. We got to listen to the Bible. Every word in the Bible is true. It's the word of God. It says it in the Bible, right? And then you get the bumper stickers, right? There's a bumper sticker I absolutely hated to see when I was a kid. It would say, God said it. I believe it. That settles it, right? It was a bumper sticker. People were proud of it. God says it. I believe it. And that settles it. What does that mean? I don't know, right? It's like, haven't people been interpreting the Bible in thousands of different ways for thousands of years? I don't know. God says it. I believe it. That settles it, right? And you get this reinvention of Protestant Christianity. The mega churches, Jerry Falwell, and what now is called the religious right, and still has a huge amount of influence among the military. Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence is one of these. Amy Coney Barrett, who just got sworn into the U.S. Supreme Court. She's like a Catholic Pentecostal. She's part of the People of Praise, community, which is like a Catholic evangelical spinoff. And that this movement, this watered down rock and roll Christianity, that's kind of how the Reagan, neoconservative Reaganomic trend was able to take over. So the question I got asked is, why do we have so many pro-life conservative Christians in the United States? It's because of this. That basically, in the early 70s, conservatives figured out that in order to, basically recruit baby boomers, they needed to invent a kind of watered-down version of Christianity, kind of a rock and roll hippie Christianity that they could recruit people with. And I grew up around that stuff, and look, I was an atheist when I was in high school. I was an absolute atheist because I couldn't stand this stuff. Still to this day, I cannot stand the evangelical stuff. It really grinds my gears. I am not an evangelical, and it's not my cup of tea. And deep respect if someone's watching and they are an evangelical. I respect your faith and all of that, but I could not stand evangelicals. It's a very obnoxious trend. There's kind of a lack of critical thinking that goes with it. And, the megachurch stuff was something Republicans invented in order to get the upper hand over the liberals after the 1960s, basically. The liberals came out of the 1960s winning, and so then you had the evangelical stuff was their way to come back. I think Kevin Sorbo, who played Hercules in the Hercules TV show, he now makes evangelical movies, right? There's a movie, God is Not Dead, and he plays this like evil professor who's trying to convince his student not to believe in God. And, there's whole TV networks where you can watch nothing but evangelical movies. And, I think Mike Huckabee, right? He's a Fox News host who's also like an evangelical. And this is a whole big part of U.S. society. It's a whole, political / religious movement that was formed in the early 70s, and probably reached its peak with George W. Bush. I think the height of that was George W. Bush. When George W. Bush, was president, this is kind of the height of these people's power. And it's in decline now, I would argue. The evangelical movement in the United States is in decline, but this is where it came from. Oh. All right. Leftism. Become anonymous with weak and soft. Alrighty. Okay, so that's a long answer to that question. All right, so 2 people asked me about Biden's infrastructure plan. It looks good. I'll just be honest with you, right? I mean, it's not enough. I mean, it's $2 trillion to rebuild a lot of roads, to rebuild crumbling infrastructure, build roads, build railway, I'm for it. I mean, we need something. I can't be against it. They're selling it. They're emphasizing the racial aspect of it. That it will help communities of color that have been cut off from their access to the U.S. economy. I'm for it. I mean, look, it's not enough. I mean, any infrastructure plan I would come up with would be 10 times that. It should come with a jobs guarantee, and that's not included, but it needs a jobs guarantee. They should guarantee a job to anyone who wants to work on it. Right? They should hire all the unemployed to work on it, like Roosevelt did. It's not enough, but it's good. It's a step in the right direction. Let's see if it happens. Right? Obama said he was going to do this. He didn't do it. Trump said he was going to do it. He didn't do it. Let's see if it actually happens. I mean, we'll see if it actually happens. All right, but I'm for it. Yeah, I mean, I'm for it. Looks good. I mean, it looks like something. It'll be a step in the right direction. We'll see. Getting to the masses, what does it mean? It means that, the person asked why, I talk about political parties and all of that. It means starting to have events that are basic introduction to communism all over the country. Not just in New York City, not just in San Francisco and in Los Angeles, but in Iowa and Kansas and in all kinds of areas throughout the United States, having powerful meetings with powerful speeches and music and classes and events to teach people about Marxism. That's what it means. It means getting to average Americans with a Marxist message. That's what it means. It means getting out of the safe spaces where leftists always go and going to average people and winning them to socialism and having events around the country dedicated to that purpose and developing an outreach team, a group of people that are able to do that full time and are able to go around promoting socialism in different parts of the country full time. That's what get to the masses means. It means developing a political or an educational organization that can go around and find people and win them to socialism. That's what it means. It means getting to people who would not ever go to a protest, would not ever go and open Marx on their own, finding average people who would never consider becoming a communist and winning them to communism. That's what it means. It means a mass educational outreach effort to win people to communism, right? That's what it means. That's what must be done. All right. All right. Someone asked about accelerationism and how I am not an accelerationist. Well, look, there is some kind of understanding of accelerationism that is different than what I understand it to be. And I understand there are people walking around calling themselves accelerationists, and what they mean is something different than what I'm about to say. But my understanding of accelerationism is this, that, you know, there are some people who argue we want things to get worse, right? That things have to get worse before they can get better, which is true. And so the job of communists is not to build a movement. It's rather to go around trying to make things worse. Well, wrong. Right? That's not correct. Right? If things get worse, but there is not a movement of the people to resist, if things get worse and people are not aware that they can resist, if things get worse and people have no class consciousness with which to interpret things getting worse, things don't get better, right? Imagine there were no communists. Imagine there were no communists and no socialists. The Great Depression happens, the 1930s. What would happen? What would have happened? Well, mass lynchings, right? There was racism. There's no communists, so, oh, well, we lost all our stuff. Well, the ruling class would say, hey, it's the black people's fault, and all the white people would be really mad because they lost everything, so they'd go and hang a bunch of black people. And, I mean, well, things got worse, but people don't automatically become revolutionary just because things get worse. And in fact, in the absence of revolutionary ideology, in the absence of a revolutionary movement, when things get worse, people's consciousness tends to get worse. Bad things happen, right? Fighting among people intensifies. Things just being bad and things just getting worse does not naturally lead to resistance. Oh, what is to be done? We'll talk about that. And that's an important thing for people to understand, that, that things just getting worse without a revolutionary movement, it doesn't lead to anything. And accelerationism is people who say, oh, we're going to vote for Republicans. That way things will get worse and then people will rise up. Not understanding that the strength, when things get worse, but people have a mass movement with which to turn to change things, that it requires a revolutionary organization, it requires a revolutionary movement to actually overthrow capitalism. That things getting worse doesn't just naturally lead to revolution. That's not how it works, right? And that's a fallacy that people fall into, is that, oh, well, I just want things to get worse. And no, yes, things getting worse eventually leads to people being open to what revolutionaries have to say, eventually motivates people to get behind revolutionary movements, etc. But things just getting worse on their own doesn't lead to it. And that's where accelerationists are wrong. Okay, was Stalin poisoned? There's speculation about that. I don't really know enough about it. And look, you have to be really careful when you talk about stuff like that. Like, I have never seen any conclusive proof that that is true. And so you have to be really careful, right? Because if you go around saying that Stalin was poisoned and you don't have any evidence of it, and somebody looks at that and thinks it's crazy, then you've been discredited, right? So, it's interesting to think about, but until I see some really solid conclusive proof that that's true, I'm not even gonna, it doesn't really matter. He was pretty old when he died. Stalin was pretty old when he died. So, yeah, Khrushchev came in and, and took a dump all over Stalin and used his attack on Stalin to, further the degeneration of the Soviet Union that ultimately led to its collapse. But I've never seen any conclusive proof that Stalin was killed. So, there you go. All right. Someone said that, that 20 years ago, the U.S. talked about weapons of mass destruction. Now they're talking about Uyghurs. Well, I don't think there's any significance to those dates. I just think it's certainly, the USA used lies to demonize Iraq that turned out to be lies. weapons of mass destruction. They used lies to demonize China. And, we know about the Uyghurs. There's great documentaries. I watched some documentaries about what's going on there. You have no idea. In the Uyghur regions, there were, pro-terrorist textbooks in all the schools. They had, like, pro-terrorist, pan-Turkist, pan-Islamist textbooks in all the schools, encouraging the kids to be terrorists. Like, you don't know, China's up against some really dangerous extremism and terrorism. People make it out like they're just racist or something. No, they're up, you really have no idea. Best books to understand Marxism, socialism. All right. Very good. Writing it down. Best books. All right. You really have no idea. You should check out, there's some great documentaries CGTN has been doing lately. Is it desirable or possible for American Marxist-Leninist parties to unify? Are there historical examples? Desirable groups to unify. That's a very good question. I will answer that question. Okay, all right. So they said that I've mentioned stuff that Farrakhan said about Libya and how important it was. What do I say to stuff that Farrakhan has said is anti-Semitic? Well, look, he said stuff about Jews that I don't agree with, that he's flat out wrong about. And there's just some things he said on the Jewish issue that is, on Jewish people, and some beliefs that he has that are not right. And I don't endorse any of that. And I do not give any endorsement to his statements about Jews whatsoever. Now, one thing I think is interesting, and this is interesting. Now, Farrakhan is known to be, he's said certain things about Jews that are not okay and are deeply offensive. What was interesting is, did you hear what he said about Bernie Sanders? I thought this was interesting. He talked about Bernie Sanders being a good person, right? And he said Bernie Sanders is a true Jew. Did you see that? He said, look, Bernie Sanders is a good person. He wants to give people health care, wants to give education. Bernie Sanders, Farrakhan, who has said a number of things about Jews that are deeply offensive and insensitive, he said that Bernie Sanders was a true Jew in his view. Well, if he thinks, that Bernie Sanders is good and that Bernie Sanders is a true Jew, that points to perhaps a side of Farrakhan, around the Jewish issue that is not as offensive as some of the other things he said. But no, I will not defend any of the, there's a lot of things he has said on that issue that I just flat out don't approve of. And that's the thing. I don't, and on the issue of LGBT, look, and on the issue of women and stuff, he has said a lot of things that are just not my view. I'm not a member of the Nation of Islam, but I can still recognize that he's a great anti-imperialist and a great force of anti-imperialism in America, a great force in the black community, getting people off drugs, organizing gang truces, organizing the Million Man March. I can recognize the good and be critical of other things, right? And that's, Alexander Dugin, right? I can recognize that he's an important anti-imperialist intellectual in Russia. He has a traditionalist conservative view. I have a Marxist progressive view, right? I don't endorse, Alexander Dugin and a lot of things he's said, but I can recognize that he's an important anti-imperialist voice in Russia, right? Iran, right? I am not a Shia Muslim, right? I am a Christian. But I can recognize that the Islamic Revolution of Iran that created a non-capitalist society that that overturned capitalism and put the state at the center of the economy, that is a force of resistance to Israel, that has great reforms and has improved the lives of working people in Iran by a lot. I can recognize what Iran has achieved, we can be critical of different forces around the world that are anti-imperialist, but at the end of the day, anti-imperialist forces around the world tend to be better than the imperialists, and that's just my understanding. Most people don't understand there's a war between chemical society and natural. I don't even know what that means, Dennis. I have no idea what that means. All right. Fascism equals imperialism when it comes to the imperial core. Well, that's one way of looking at it. That's one way of looking at it. One interpretation that I've heard is that fascism is, fascism is an attempt to preserve, when there's a capitalist crisis in the imperialist homeland. Some people have said that fascism is an uprising by industrial capital against finance capital in the imperialist homeland. It's there's many different interpretations. Fascism is not anti-imperialist, and that's one of the fallacies. I debated one of these fascists, what was his name? Cultured Doug. He was trying to say that fascism was anti-imperialist, and I said, really? That's interesting. So why did Mussolini invade Ethiopia, and why did Mussolini, brutally suppress the people of Libya? And he said, "Oh, that was a mistake. It's a mistake." Really? Well, fascists always make the same mistake now, don't they? Right? When Hitler took power in Germany, Germany had been stripped of its colonies. What was the first thing the Nazis started doing? Trying to re-seize colonies, right? Fascism, Nazi Germany, was basically the German imperialists trying to regain their colonies and regain imperialism. Italian fascism was, fascism trying to restore the rule of Italian finance capital in Africa and elsewhere, right? Portugal. The Portuguese colonialists. Look at what they did in Angola. Look at what they did in various parts of Africa. Franco in Spain. Come on, right? The notion that fascism is not imperialist, right? Is utterly ridiculous. Now, there are Bonapartist struggles within the ruling class that happen, right? There are different factions within the ruling class. Go read Karl Marx's pamphlet on Louis Bonaparte, on Napoleon III, the 18th Brumaire. It's a very important pamphlet, right, about a Bonapartist figure in France that is, when French society is in crisis, you have, Louis Bonaparte becoming the dictator, overthrowing parliament, builds kind of a mob of lumpen proletarians to kick the ass of the rest of the capitalist class. It's worth reading, to understand these struggles. But fascism is definitely imperialist. All right. Someone asked about Webster Tarpley. Webster Tarpley is an analyst. He was a follower of Lyndon LaRouche for many years. There was some kind of falling out between him and the LaRouche movement in the 90s. I don't know what it's about. I met Tarpley in 2015 when he was leading. He had a demonstration at the United Nations when Russia was sending its military to Syria to support the Syrian Arab Republic. He had a demonstration, welcome Putin the peacemaker, supporting Russia's efforts to make peace in Syria. I went to that demonstration. Shook hands. I made some remarks about Syria. And that's about it. And now, unfortunately, Webster Tarpley, I understand now he's he's pushing the Russiagate conspiracy theories that somehow Russia rigged the elections and got Trump elected. And his view is not my view. He's not a Marxist, right? He has the kind of the LaRouchian American system view, but he hates the LaRouche people now, and he had some falling out with them, and they tended to be kind of friendlier to Trump, and he was preaching, that Trump was I don't know. I don't know. He's a commentator in the United States, right? That's Webster Tarpley, and he's from the LaRouchian tradition, the tradition of Lyndon LaRouche, but he had a falling out with the Lyndon LaRouche movement. They don't like each other no more. And they're on the opposite sides of a lot of issues. The Lyndon LaRouche movement is very pro-China now, and I believe Webster Tarpley is very anti-China. So I don't know. I don't speak for the LaRouche movement. I know some of their people, and I think they do good work around China. They promote the Belt and Road Initiative. They have a worldview that is not my worldview. I'm a Marxist. Their worldview is, they argue there's the American system, and that's not my perspective, right? I don't think that there's the American system. I understand that there was a difference, that what Hamilton advocated, what Alexander Hamilton advocated, what Henry Clay advocated, was different than what eventually emerged from American imperialism, and there was kind of an industrialist current. But ultimately, I think what makes China a strong society is socialism, is socialism. And what made Roosevelt able to do his great reforms was the support of the labor movement, of the Communist Party. And I got up at a LaRouche meeting and I told them that, right? I went to one of their forums one time, and they were talking about Roosevelt and how great Roosevelt was, which I agree with. And they were talking about China and how great China is, and I agree with. And I got up and I just straight up said, look, and I've got an audio recording. I don't want to post it. It's probably not a good thing to do. But, I recorded it on my phone, and I got up and I said, look, Roosevelt did what he did because he had the support of the Communist Party. In China, the Communist Party is in charge, right? And it's the elephant in the room. And they just, oh, no, that can't be the case. They have their view, which is not a Marxist view, right? They were Marxists a long time ago. They were Trotskyites. They reject Marxism now. They believe in the American system, Alexander Hamilton and stuff, and I don't agree with them on that. And they were much more pro-Trump than I was. I was never, as much as I didn't like Hillary Clinton, I was never thinking that I would never have voted for Donald Trump. The anti-immigrant stuff, the anti-Muslim stuff. But, they really did believe Trump was a force for good in the United States. You know, in some ways he might have been better than the Democrats. In other ways, he was way worse than the Democrats. But you know, so I was, you know, I didn't take a position during the elections, but no, I mean they were much more sympathetic to Trump. So you know, they have their views and I have mine, right? And again, I can recognize the good work that they do for China and promoting the Belt and Road and criticizing free market policies in the United States and highlighting the strengths of China. But I can also have things I disagree with them about. Again, just like Farrakhan, just like Dugan, right? I will talk to people that are anti imperialist, right? Imperialism is the main danger to all humanity. The system where Western corporations dominate the world and grind people into poverty and use wars and sanctions and destruction and color revolutions to tear down any country that doesn't submit to their will, that is the main danger to the people of the world. And if you're a serious communist, you're a serious communist, right? You're not, you know, somebody wants to open a pencil factory. You know, if you're not, you know, if you're a serious communist, you will have the understanding that if there are people that are anti-imperialist, we want to talk to them, right? If you're a serious communist, right? Now, if you're a LARPer, you want to pretend you're Mao or you know Che Guevara and you want to dress up in a costume, go do that, right? If you think communism just means you think all Republicans are Nazis and you're pro-trans and you want to start a worker cooperative and you're a big fan of Skippy the Bear or Jabba the Vosh, you go do that. But if you're a real, genuine communist, you understand that the main contradiction in the world today is U.S. imperialism dominating the world, neoliberal economics, grinding countries into poverty, and enforcing it with ugly wars and sanctions and all of that. And so any country that breaks out of that system and any force, you know, in the world that is standing up against that system, you are going to be able to sit down with. Right, you're going to have a relationship with them. You may not agree with them, and and also, I'll just be real with you about this. To be anti-imperialist in our time, you more or less are going to be forced to start being more and more socialist, and that's just a reality, right? You know, they may not want it, and I've seen this all over the world. This has happened. It's Venezuela socialist, right? All over the world, this has happened, right? When Chavez first got elected in Venezuela, you know, he said he was against both capitalism and socialism. But look what happened, right? And that in any country in the world, right? You know, the Iranians, right? I mean, they hated communism. They were a religious movement. But if you look at what they've done, they have built a system, not capitalism, but Islam, with 5-year economic plans and all. That if you really fight the imperialists, you're going to be forced to move in a socialist direction because the way the imperialists dominate the world is with the free market, right? The free market, hey, the strongest wins. They just happen to be on top of the world. They rule the world, right? They've got the biggest banks and they've got all the wealth, right? So any country that breaks out of imperialism is going to be forced to start moving in a socialist direction. They may not fully get there, right? They may, there are many examples of countries starting to move that direction and then not. But the more anti-imperialist a country becomes, the more socialist it's going to have to be in order to maintain its anti-imperialism. And that's just a reality. And furthermore, if there are forces in the West that are anti-imperialist, that are working against this system, in order for them to be, to continue to be anti-imperialist, they're going to have to become friendlier to anti-imperialist forces around the world, and they're going to have to become more and more critical of capitalism. Anybody who's anti-imperialist, I will talk to, and I'm not going to agree with them, and I may tell them they're flat out wrong, but if you're anti-imperialist, I'm going to talk to you. Imperialism is a brutal, ugly system. I've seen what the imperialists did in Ecuador. When I was a small child, I went to Ecuador, and I saw what neoliberal economic reforms did there, creating a man-made famine, and imperialism is destroying this country. Neoliberalism is destroying this country. So, and if you're a serious communist, if you really want to get rid of this system of imperialism, you will have that attitude. If you just want to play on the internet and pretend you're some historical figure and all that, that's different. But if you're a real anti-imperialist, you'll do what I did, and you'll sit down with conservative anti-capitalists, you'll sit down with Muslim anti-capitalists, you'll sit down with the Nation of Islam, you'll sit down with anybody who is talking about how do we get rid of this imperialist system, anyone who's standing with anti-imperialists around the world, you'll find a way to relate to them, You may disagree with them. It may not even be appropriate to have any joint activity with them, right? And that's important, right? There are some, but you will understand them. You will understand what you agree with them and what you disagree with them about. You may even have dialogue with them, but if you're a serious Marxist, you'll understand imperialism is the main contradiction. All right. Are the U.S. imperialists shooting themselves in the foot, destroying the imperialists? I mean, look, their system is naturally built into to self-destruct. They're trying to adopt an anti-imperialist, or they're trying to adopt a more managerial approach to save their system, but their system is doomed, right? We know about the boom-bust cycle of capitalism, overproduction, the general law of capitalist accumulation, the falling rate of profit, right? The computer revolution is destroying capitalism, right? Read City Builders and Vandals, read We Are City Builders. I talk about the economics of it. What Marx talked about in Capital, the built-in self-destruction of capitalism. I heard you, Joseph, and I've been there, and I don't agree with that. The built-in self-destruction of capitalism, right? That is that is working itself out. The computer revolution drives workers out of production, eliminates labor. This is the greatest crisis of overproduction in the history of capitalism. The computer revolution, artificial intelligence, you can't have capitalism. A system where people only can work so long as they sell their labor to a boss, and a system where you have robots and machines doing everything, doesn't work that way, right? Eventually, the people who've been outcast from the system, the people who've been thrown out of the machines, they're going to have to seize control of the machines and force them to work for the good of all society. Right? Go read Nelson Peary and his very important book, The Future is Up to Us. Because capitalism is doomed. Capitalism and computers don't work together. And I talk about that at great length elsewhere. And I've got a lot of super chats to get to, but it's in my books, it's in my writing. What Marx said about the natural failure of capitalism very much applies to the computer revolution. All right. Was the Roman Empire a force for good? I don't think so. But the fall of the Roman Empire made things a lot worse. I mean, there was a lot more instability. But the idea that the Roman Empire was a force for good, I don't think it was a force for good. All right. The Georgia voting law is horrendous. People should be able to drink bottled water while they're standing in line to vote, right? The ID requirements. No, look, voter restrictions, unacceptable, right? Everyone who is a U.S. citizen should be able to vote. Look, people who've been to prison should be able to vote, right? Why not? Right? You went to jail, you did your time, you got out, you should be able to vote, right? This notion, this effort to keep people from voting is reprehensible, and it's indefensible, right? It's just basic. As a politician, you should be patriotic and want to increase civic participation. When you have, people actively trying to change the laws to keep people from voting, that's wrong, and that's just basic immorality. If you want people to vote for you, try to change your policies or appeal to them. Don't try to keep people from voting. Any politician who's trying to keep people from voting, that's not right. All right. Tolstoy, very important Russian writer. He wrote War and Peace, which is it's one of the most important novels in European history. It's about Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the Russian people's resistance to Napoleon. He's a very important writer, very, very important writer. When you describe Iran, I didn't say that. Didn't say that. All righty. I'm not going to have that conversation tonight. I've talked about that before. I did not say that. Don't put words in my mouth. All right. Charles Dickens, also a very important writer. Charles Dickens, he wrote all kinds of novels that were written about the Industrial Revolution in Britain and its effect on people. You got Oliver Twist, you got A Christmas Carol, you got Great Expectations. What else? You got many, many novels. He was a novelist. He was not a socialist. His novels basically were decrying the heartlessness of capitalism and showing the heartless British society, as British imperialism was an ascendancy, the age of industrial capitalism in Britain. Tale of Two Cities, right, which was kind of an attack on the French Revolution. But he doesn't call for socialism. He calls for morality. He calls for people to be kind and love each other. And he condemns the heartlessness of it. And but it's not socialism. Not socialism. It's just kind of a liberal moralizing critique of Britain as it was becoming an industrial power. Okay. One thing I think is neat is Malthusianism, right? I rant and rave against Malthusianism. Scrooge in A Christmas Carol is a Malthusian, right? And it's in every movie version and every cartoon, right? Someone's getting thrown out of their home, and he's a ruthless banker, and he's throwing people out of their home, um, and uh, and he says, "This is what the poorhouses are for," and the person says, "But some people would rather die than go to a poorhouse." He says, "Well, if they'd rather die, then they better do it and decrease the surplus population." He's a Malthusian, and that's a direct reference to Malthus, to Robert Thomas Malthus, and that's what the British ruling class was saying, right? People should starve to decrease the surplus population, right? So, the evil of British imperialism, the evil of British imperial society that Charles Dickens is ranting against is very much incarnated by Scrooge and by Malthusianism. I think that's kind of interesting. But, there's some anti-Semitism. Look, there's that Fagin character. There's in Oliver Twist, there's a Jewish character who like uses homeless kids to, steal things from people, rural areas in a revolution. Okay. That's, and it's kind of religious and moralizing. It's actually a lot like Victor Hugo. Nowadays we think that Les Miserables, because in the 1970s they made this like Marxist musical out of Les Miserables. Do you hear the people sing? People think that Les Miserables is this real. Victor Hugo was like a revolutionary or something. He's not, right? He's not. If you read even that book, you read it, the students are portrayed as naive, and the point of the book, it's a lot like Charles Dickens. It's like the world is evil, people just need to be nice and love each other and be religious. And that's basically what Charles Dickens is saying. He's showing the heartlessness of British society and saying, can't we all be nice? Can't we all just get along? That's basically what he's saying. So he stops short of being revolutionary. But it's that atmosphere that Charles Dickens wrote about. It's that atmosphere that gave birth to Marx. Frederick Engels, I believe it was his first major work, is called The Conditions of the Working Class in England. And it's basically the nonfiction version of Charles Dickens. It's all the stuff in the Charles Dickens books, except it's not fiction. It's like, this is how workers are living. This is what goes on in their factories. This is how unemployed people live. This is how starving children live. that's The Conditions of the Working Class in England by Frederick Engels is the nonfiction version of Charles Dickens' writings. So there you go. Was imperialist Japan fascist? I don't know. I can see that. There's the military culture in Japan, the Black Dragon Society, the assassinations, the wave of assassinations. Maybe. I don't know enough about it, honestly. All right. A lot of fascists love Japan, I'll tell you that much. There's a lot of fascistic thinking in Japan even now. There's a lot of like demagogue fascist people in Japan who admire Mussolini or admire, and think that Japan was somehow right in World War II. That's a weird thing about Japan, is that there is like a tolerance in Japanese society for fascist demagogues. There's plenty of them. And every so often Japan will try to change the textbook. They'll try to change the school textbooks and edit out, their massacres of Chinese people. And, there is a far right edge of Japanese society that is very, very dangerous. Okay, the Rosenberg's execution. Horrendous. Look, okay, right? Like, let's take the whole thing, all right? So, the Rosenbergs were not executed for espionage because they were not convicted of espionage. They were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. They couldn't prove they'd actually given anything to the Soviets. They argued at the trial that they could prove that they had conspired to possibly do it, right? And conspiracy to commit espionage is not a death penalty offense, right? Espionage is, conspiracy to commit espionage is not. So even on that basis, they shouldn't have gotten the death penalty. People ask, were they really guilty? And honestly, I don't know enough about the case. I just don't, right? I know that their son, he maintains that they are innocent, and has set up the Rosenberg Fund for children, and that gives aid to the children of people that are in prison, and that there are many people that feel they were innocent. Another thing was the key piece of evidence against them at the trial was they were members of the Communist Party, and that there was a whiff of anti-Semitism in the whole thing, right? I mean, they really played up the fact that they were Jewish, that they had been members of the Communist Party. The Pope said not to execute the Rosenbergs. The whole world basically said to the United States, don't do this, and they did it anyway. So there you go. I don't know enough about that guy, Henry. I just don't know enough about him. Yeah, it was a horrendous event, and it was kind of the climax of McCarthyism. It was kind of the climax of McCarthyism. And after the execution of the Rosenbergs, after the death of Stalin, after Joe McCarthy drank himself to death, McCarthyism in the United States started to slow down. It was kind of the darkest before dawn of McCarthyism. And many communists, that was the darkest moment for them. I mean, it was the darkest moment for them. I mean, I've heard people talk about, the night the Rosenbergs were executed. There's like somebody who talks about like the night the Rosenbergs were executed. Their mother was crying while their father was burning all their Marxist books in the fireplace. And people were terrified, right? And the Communist Party was underground, and they had the Makarin Internal Security Act that set up a network of concentration camps to put communists in. It was intense stuff. So were the Celts socialist? I mean, you're talking about the people, the ancient Celts, right? The ancient, people of Scotland and Ireland. No, they were not. I mean, no, socialism is a stage higher than capitalism. So, you had hunter-gatherer civilization, you had the beginning, you had agriculture and slave society, you had feudalism, and then you had capitalism. I think, the Celts existed in feudalism, and I mean, so, I don't think that the Celtic tribes of Britain and Ireland, I do not think they were practicing socialism. No, I don't think so. Someone asked about the Book of Revelations. I talked a lot about that in the opening remarks. There you go. Someone asked about this Winnie the Pooh stuff. I've seen that. That's like a thing that they say about China that, it's like a meme against the Chinese president or something. I mean, I don't know. I don't believe a lot of stuff that I hear. I'll just be honest with you. I'll have to ask my friends in China about it. When I stream with comrades in China, red comrades in China, I'll ask them what's the deal with that, because I don't know. Something doesn't sound right about it. It's like I always hear stuff in American media, and it's like, and at the end of the day, who really cares? Who really cares, right? I've heard that Winnie the Pooh. Someone pointed out that Winnie the Pooh is like a study in mental illness. Like all the characters in Winnie the Pooh have a mental illness, right? Like Pooh is an addict. He's like obsessed with honey. And he like is always getting himself in trouble because he has this addiction. He cannot control his desire for honey. And the donkey is like depressive and like, can't get anywhere, and and is just, is depressed. And then Tigger, is like manic, and he's like in a mania, and he's bouncing around, and it's just like, it's almost like, the Christopher Robin kid. He's supposed to be this lonely kid, and then he has this fantasy about all these different animals, and all the animals seem to have some kind of psychological disorder, right? They're all just like a caricature of like a mental illness, right? I don't know. I mean, that's one analysis I've heard of it, that it's like a case study in like psychology textbooks. All right. The Bay of Pigs invasion. You want to play by play? All right. USA sends a bunch of Cuban exiles to Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. They arrive in Cuba, and Cuba kicks their ass. How's that? That's the Bay of Pigs invasion. Yeah, I mean, there's not much more to it than that. Cuba destroyed them, and they didn't even have to put their literacy campaign on hold. They didn't, right? Their literacy campaign happened, and they were still, they never put it on hold. The whole time they're having they're fighting the Cuban exiles. Yeah, didn't happen. And I guess the U.S., a lot of the military wanted to follow up the failed Bay of Pigs invasion with a U.S. invasion, and Kennedy wasn't going to do that. So that might have been something that contributed to Kennedy's downfall, but we shall see. Israeli elections. Well, look, Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel is very strong. because since the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of very, very poor people from the former Soviet Union, thank you, Eduardo, who are Jewish, they've moved to Israel and they live on settlements and they are very, very conservative. And they are much more in line with Netanyahu. Whereas, Israelis that have been there since the beginning, or their parents were there since the beginning, and they live in urban areas, they tend to be more liberal, right? And the Israeli Labor Party has gotten weaker and weaker and weaker, and the Likud Party has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, Menachem Begin was kind of the turning point, right? The rise of Menachem Begin, that was a big turning point, and Menachem Begin was a good friend of Milton Friedman. And he brought Milton Friedman, who wrecked the Israeli economy, and the Israeli right wing. Look, Israel is a right wing country. When Israel began, they wanted the whole world to think that they were a big socialist commune in the desert, right? It was the Israeli Labor Party, and the Soviet Union supported them. And it was like Israel was just this big hippy dippy socialist kibbutzim in the desert, but just so happens there were other people living there called Palestinians. And part of the way that the Israelis justified their crimes against Palestinians was with white supremacy. We're white Europeans. These are inferior non-European people. And, if that's the way your society is set up, you can't be very liberal and hippy-dippy and socialist, can you? No. And so, the longer Israel has been around, the more and more Israel has started more and more basically, becoming right wing. I mean, I've worked with Israelis who have defended apartheid in South Africa, and I mean these things happen. So Israel is a pretty right wing country at this point. There is a big liberal section of Israeli society, right? I mean, there are many Israeli liberals and leftists, and Israel maintains more of a social democratic welfare state than the United States does, right? I mean, they've got health care for their population, they've got more protections for labor unions and stuff. But overall, I mean, the nature of Israel is becoming more and more right wing as time goes by. Alrighty. How did the Eastern Bloc, the communist parties of the Eastern Bloc, lose credibility with their populations? I think that it was the fact that these countries again were blockaded. That there was the high technology treaties that no country could sell them high technology. That they were forced to spend lots of money on defense. They adopted a much more authoritarian style. They didn't have the same level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And that increasingly, a lot of the leaders, of the communist parties around the time of the 80s, you had a whole layer of people within the ruling communist parties who didn't believe in communism, right? The only way you could get ahead in Soviet or in Eastern Bloc society was by joining the Communist Party. The communist bureaucracy was really the only place you could rise up, and there were a lot of people who went into the communist parties who didn't believe in communism, just went there because they wanted to be big bosses, right? And the Gorbachev wing in the Soviet Union, a lot of these liberalizing elements, right? There was an increasing number of people who talked communism when they had to, but behind the scenes, they just wanted power, they just wanted authority. And, and there was an effort to infiltrate and manipulate them and divide Poland and Czechoslovakia and East Germany from the Soviet Union. And there was a huge effort by the United States to try to manipulate these aspects of the Soviet Union. And Brzezinski, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was probably the strategist who had the most to do with it. But ultimately, there was a huge effort by the United States to understand these countries, how they operated, how people thought, and manipulate the countries. And at the time that the Eastern Bloc fell, most of the people who were protesting against the governments of the Eastern Bloc didn't want capitalism. They just wanted more freedom, and they wanted, they thought they could keep their guaranteed job, keep their guaranteed health care, keep their guaranteed education, and shop at Walmart. It doesn't work that way. But that's why synthetic leftism, that's why, social democracy, Trotskyism, these things are very important because it's about manipulating people to serve imperialism while thinking that they're also against capitalism. All right. Why is leftism in the United States associated with becoming soft? I think that that's because of the fact that the right wing, it really comes out of the 60s, right? The right wing is associated with being pro-military. Left wing is associated with being not wanting to fight in the military. And that, look, there's a class edge to that, right? Joining the military is a very working class thing to do, right? Rich kids do not want to join the army, right? Working class people are the kind of people that join the army. The working, and so in the 60s, leftism became associated with more middle class people who didn't want to get drafted, and pacifism, more social tolerance and such. So that became what it meant to be a leftist. And conservatives were rah rah, we're for the military, we're conservative. So there you go. Why are so many Christian clergy becoming so reactionary? Spain, it was heavenly pro-Franco. Yeah, we can talk about that, right? Spain, Franco, clergy, right wing. I think that's part of it. And part of it has also been that, it's not about class struggle anymore. It's not about class struggle. That in a lot of ways, leftism in the United States has become a culture war, right? And it's hedonists and Stoics, right? And that the right wing are the hedonists, and the left wing have become the Stoics. Well, communists are neither hedonists nor Stoics. We're working class revolutionaries. We're city builders. That's what we are, and that's what my book, We Are City Builders. That's what City Builders and Vandals. We're neither hedonists nor Stoics. We're city builders. There you go. But yeah, I'd argue that leftism post-1960s in the United States has degenerated into a form of Stoicism, which is Stoicism is softer, right? Hedonism is cruel and selfish, and Stoicism is soft, right? Well, there's nothing wrong with being nice. I'm all for people being nice. But at the end of the day, socialism is about strength. It's about strengthening and empowering the working class. Alrighty, what is to be done? Very important book by Lenin. Lenin basically argues that in order to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy in Russia, they need to build a party of new type. And this is the Vanguard Party, a party of professional revolutionaries. And this party will not, that you need this party because of spontaneity, right? That not because of spontaneity, but because left to its own devices, the spontaneous uprisings of the workers will never lead to socialism, right? You need oh boy, American Hugo Chavez. I'm starting to lose my strength, folks. I'm fading fast, so you might not get the long answers you want here because I'm fading. That's okay. You need this group of professional revolutionaries because left to its own devices, the working class isn't going to develop revolutionary socialist consciousness. You need a conscious group of professional revolutionaries. You need a party of new type, people who give the whole of their lives to the Revolutionary Party, the revolutionary movement. And those people engage in agitation and propaganda. Agitation is for the broad masses to stir them up against the system. Propaganda is to the advanced. You teach them communist theory. The Vanguard Party goes among the masses and finds the agitators, the people that are always, making trouble and organizing unions and stuff. And it finds the agitators and it pays them so they don't have to spend their days working, and it just pays them to go around agitating. And it's a Leninist theory, and honestly, I'll just be honest with you, I think it's very outdated, right? It worked pretty well in Russia in early 1900s, but there's a lot about it that's pretty outdated. It's how a Vanguard Party, it's how the Bolsheviks made their revolution. There's plenty to learn from it. People should study it. It's a very important book. It rejects left adventurism and terrorism. It talks about the party of a new type and how it intervenes. Why you don't engage in tailism, and just, whenever the masses and this is what most communist parties do. Whenever the masses are rising up already, they chase behind them going, we agree with you and we're communists. The masses are in motion around Black Lives Matter. Well, communists run behind them and shout, you're marching for Black Lives Matter. We're communists and we agree with you on that. And then they wonder why the workers don't just follow them, right? The workers are in the streets demanding $15 an hour, and the communists, run behind them. You believe in $15 an hour? We're communists, and we agree with $15. And it's like, no, the reason they're not following you is because you're not in front of them. You're behind them, right? And that's the point Lenin makes and what is to be done. He says, like, what he calls bowing to spontaneity, right, is a trend, right, that the Social Democratic Party of Russia was doing, right? When the workers are already in motion and communists just kind of run behind them going, yeah, we agree with you and we're communists, right? That's not what revolutionaries should be doing, right? Revolutionaries instead should be going to the masses and telling them things they don't know, right? Right? Not just tailing after what people already think and trying to give it a political character, right? And the job of the Revolutionary Party is, as Lenin argues, the job of the Revolutionary Party is agitation and propaganda, stirring up a bigger confrontation in broader society while finding people that are capable of being communists and winning them to communism, right? And propagating, right? And that it's kind of a contradiction, because on the one hand you're creating chaos, and on the other hand you're building a very disciplined organization. You're building order. So in your own ranks you're building all kinds of order, and among the masses you're creating chaos, right? So I mean, what do communists want? Order or chaos? Both. They want order and discipline among their own ranks, and they want chaos in the broader society. This is all very outdated. I'm just telling you, right? I've studied this stuff extensively, and it should be studied. And I would teach a class on what is to be done tomorrow. We all need to understand it. But at the end of the day, if all it took to, if the answer to building a socialist movement in the United States was just digging this stuff up and understanding it properly, we would have done it already, right? Obviously there are some ways that a lot of this stuff doesn't work in the age of information. Look, when Lenin wrote What is to be Done, 1903 Russia, 60% of the population was illiterate. 60% of the population was illiterate. Now, not only can people read, they're reading on their phones every day. So this idea that you're going to form this group that's like going to kind of like manipulate and trick people into having a communist revolution, yeah, don't count on it. Don't count on it. But should we learn how Lenin did it? Of course we should. So there you go. All right. Best books on Marxism. The best book on Marxism that I ever read was called The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. That is the best book on Marxism I have ever read. If you read that book, you will understand the history of the communist movement. It is the best book on Marxism ever. The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. I also recommend, there's a couple other books I would recommend. Why Communism by Moishe Olgin. Very good pamphlet from the Communist Party in the 1930s. I would recommend, what else? I would recommend, there's a lot of good books. Towards Soviet America by William Z. Foster. Twilight of World Capitalism by William Z. Foster. I would recommend reading Mao's Little Red Book, the quotations from Chairman Mao, Little Red Book. That's pretty good. I would recommend, what else would I recommend? I would recommend the Communist Manifesto. I would recommend, I encourage people to, the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, short course. That's a very important book. That's very good. I would recommend a lot of, before you read the classics, you need to read History of the Three Internationals, because you need to understand who they're talking about. The Marxist tradition is very polemical. It's people arguing with each other. And if you don't know who those people are, you don't know the context of the arguments, you're not going to understand it. You need to know the First International, the Second International, the Third International, Bolshevism, social democracy, Kautskyism, anarchism. You need the background to all of this. So read the History of the Three Internationals, and as you read it, read the works that are cited in it, right? There's not a single, that book extensively cites all the great Marxist writers, so I would recommend that, right? There's some very good polemics, right? There's the key works of Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, what else? The State and Revolution, right? What is to be Done? These are all very, very important books. And Marx, I got a lot out of reading the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte about how the capitalist class works and the fights among the capitalist class. I got a lot out of reading Theories of Surplus Value, which is based on Karl Marx's notebooks assembled by Karl Kautsky. I got a lot out of reading Capital, right? And especially the later sections of Capital about, primitive accumulation and how capitalism emerged with like mass killing. And, in order to create capitalism, you had to kill lots of people in order to break apart the feudal commons. There's a lot of very important Marxist works out there. All right. Is it desirable for Marxist-Leninist groups in the United States to unify? No, it is not. And the reason is that Marxist-Leninist groups in the United States are irrelevant. I mean, I'm just being real with you. There is no communist group in the United States that is relevant at this time. I mean, DSA kind of, but it's not a Marxist group. I mean, DSA is the pro-imperialist social democratic organization. There's a lot of good Marxists in DSA, right? There's a lot of great people in DSA, but DSA is dominated by reformist social democratic pro-imperialist politics. But aside from DSA, that does have they've got a couple 100,000 people or something. Aside from them, most communist groups are very, very small, less than 100 people, and average people have no clue what they believe, and wouldn't understand it if they did. The problem with unifying all these groups is if you unified them, in order to get all those people to join one group, in order to do that, you would have to accommodate all of the craziness that keeps them separated from the masses. There's a reason these people are separated from the masses. It's because they're crazy, right? I'll just be honest with you. I mean, a lot of these groups are nuts, okay? You got, there's groups that want to legalize pedophilia. There are groups that think World War II is still going on. There are groups that have a really disgusting cult of personality around their leader. There are groups that walk around promoting violence, and look, a lot of these groups, they're small and they're the ego trip of one or two people. At the end of the day, it's one or two people's little ego trip, okay, and it's a boomer, and usually it's a boomer white male, and that white male though, and I kid you not, and sounds awful, every single one of these groups is led by a white male, and the groups are overwhelmingly white people. Older white people. But they will sit there and they will say, the leader of our group is a white guy who truly understands the black people. No white guy understands the black people like the leader of our group does. And our group, our leader, I mean, he may be white, but deep down, he's black. Oh, it's the sickest, weirdest thing ever, okay? It is weird and gross. It is awkward, okay? And I mean, I have heard that from Trotskyite groups. They start swearing that their leader truly understands the blacks. I've heard that from Maoists, that their leader truly understands the blacks. It's like, folks, I'm a white guy, and I will never, ever try to tell you that deep down, that is, that's like when someone starts talking that way, that means they have a white savior complex. That's what that means. And a lot of these boomers, I'll just tell you, they are white people who have a white savior complex. Because the civil rights movement was a big deal in the 70s and in the 60s when they were politically active, and they have it in their minds that all the other white people are evil. They're all a bunch of racist rednecks, but they are a good white person sent to Earth to be the savior of the black people, and they're anti-populist, and they're not healthy, okay? And that's so many groups I could name. I'm not just talking about groups I've been involved with. I'm talking about groups I haven't been involved with. I've been to so many communist workshops, and a lot of these groups are pretty culty, and they control people's lives, and they split, and they split, and they split, and they don't have a future, okay? And if you try to unify those groups, you would have to somehow function, whatever unified body came into existence, would somehow have to accommodate all the crazy of all those people to keep them happy enough to be in the same room. There's a reason these people have divided and fallen apart, for so long. There's a reason these people have split and not been around, for so long. These people have been fracturing and been irrelevant. And the reason for that, is that on some level they're out of touch. Okay. And, and there's a reason then, and the thing is, there needs to be left unity, not unity of all the little tiny irrelevant communist parties. There needs to be unity of communist ideas and socialist ideas with the masses of American people. That's where the unity needs to be. Okay? That's where the unity needs to be. Get to the masses, out of the movement to the masses. Look, I never would tell anyone to quit their group. And I know people in this group and that group and the other group and all of that, and I never would tell anyone to leave their group. I'm not starting a group to compete with all the other groups. I'm starting an educational group, the Center for Political Innovation. It's not a party, to get to the masses, to get done what needs to be done. We got to get to the masses. All right. Is Venezuela socialist? Well, the Venezuelans, they say that they are not fully socialist yet. They are moving towards socialism. I think that Venezuela is socialist because the economy of Venezuela is centered around state controlled natural resources. The private companies that exist in Venezuela are all dependent and directed by the state. There's a network of collectivos and worker cooperatives. So I would argue, in my view, because the state is controlled by revolutionaries, because the state of Venezuela controls the economy is centered around state controlled natural resources and it's centrally planned. I would argue that Venezuela is a socialist society by my definition. But according to the state ideology of Venezuela, their position is that they are a society that is moving towards socialism. And I respect that, right? I do not say societies are socialist if the people do not say they are socialist. So the government of Venezuela is led by socialists. They argue they are on the road towards socialism. I respect that. Are rural areas important in revolutions? Sure. I mean, wherever the working class people are, I respect that. All right. And I mean, you need to speak to all kinds of different people. The USA is a really big country, right? There's urban areas, there's and all that, but there are rural areas too. There's the South, there's the Midwest, there's all kinds of things. Look, I've lived in this country my whole life, and there are times I realize there are parts of this country I didn't know about. When I worked in Washington, D.C. For a while, a number of the people I worked with were Mormons. And I realized that, I grew up in a town where there were maybe 3 Mormon kids at my school. You go to Washington, you go to Seattle, you go to Arizona, Mormons are a really big deal. I knew nothing about Mormons. So I bought a biography of Joseph Smith and I watched a lot of documentaries and I realized that, hey, look at a U.S. map, Washington, right? Oregon, Idaho, Utah, Arizona. Mormons are a big deal there. And that's a big part of American society is Mormonism. I didn't know anything about Mormonism, but culturally, right? There's a lot of people who don't, they come from Mormon families, they no longer believe, but culturally, it's a big deal in the United States. So I studied Mormonism, right? Because I realized that if I'm going to be a serious political person in the United States, I need to know what Mormonism is, right? Look, there are Chinese communities, and we talk about these anti-Asian hate crimes that are happening in California. There are Chinese communities that have been in this country for well over 100 years. And they have a unique culture that's very different from more recent Asian immigrants. We should know about these things. If you are a serious political person in a country, you need to know the people of the country. It's a very important thing. So there you go. All right. In Spain, many of the clergy were reactionary. Why is that? That's because Spain had not fully broken out of feudalism yet, right? Feudalism was still well intact throughout the countryside, and the Catholic Church is an institution that maintains feudalism. I mean, basically, that was the height of the Catholic Church before the Reformation. Before the rise of capitalism, the Catholic Church had absolute power. And in Spain, the reason they had the Spanish Inquisition in the 1490s was because the Protestant Reformation was happening all across Europe, and Spain was a stronghold of Catholicism. And so you had a crackdown. You had the infamous Spanish Inquisition. And yes, even up into the 1930s, Spain still had feudalism all throughout the countryside. So yeah, the clergy, because they were defenders of feudalism, they were reactionaries. And Franco was fighting the communists. The communists were associated with land redistribution. You had the anarchist ultra-leftists that were, killing landlords and redistributing land. Well, the Catholic Church was defending feudalism. Right, a lot of the Catholic anti-capitalism, and this is a point that needs to be made. A lot of the anti-capitalist doctrine of the Catholic Church is basically a defense of feudalism. So there you go. What would an American Hugo Chavez look like? I have no idea. Right now, the U.S. military is not set up in a way that could create a Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez is the result of a lot of unique circumstances in Venezuela. I don't think an American Hugo Chavez is possible at this time. I would love that if that could happen. That would be great. Will you be doing seminars like the one on scientific socialism after the pandemic? Damn right I will be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they'll have to cut my tongue out if they want to shut me up. I'm sure there's people thinking about it somewhere in this country. But yes, no, I'm not going to stop. I am not going to stop. I'll be doing all kinds of seminars, hopefully in different parts of the country. All righty, folks, I thank you for sticking with us. It's been a great night. Whatever holiday you're observing, I wish you the best on that. And thanks for joining us. It's late. I'm going to bed. Have a good weekend. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world.